Welcome to the Late Lab. It is a pleasure to have you here. Before settling in, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Maybe this is reaching you in a darkened bedroom, with the lights low and the day finally beginning to loosen its grip. Maybe it is keeping you company on a late journey home, or playing softly beside a blanket, a lamp and a cup gone slowly cool. Wherever you are, feel free to share it below, and may tonight find you comfortable, safe, and ready to wander gently into deep time. If these slow little journeys through science are the sort of thing that make the evening feel a touch calmer, then a like and subscribe do help this small channel keep going. And to those already returning here night after night, thank you. It truly does matter. Now, there is always a slight risk with dinosaurs that the mind becomes a little too alert. Giant skeletons, vanished worlds, teeth the size of kitchen knives, feathers where scales were once expected, and the quiet, unsettling thought that some of the strangest creatures ever to walk the earth were not monsters at all, but living animals with routines, instincts, and ordinary days. Not exactly ideal bedtime material. Still, there are worse reasons to stay awake for a few extra minutes. So let the modern picture fall away for a while. Let the museum poses, the film roars, and the old reptilian clichés fade into the background. Because the real question is far more interesting. What were dinosaurs really like? And how different were they from the creatures people thought they knew? For a very long time, dinosaurs were treated less like animals and more like symbols. They were imagined as thunderous giants, scaled and snarling, built almost entirely from teeth, claws, and cinematic bad temper. They stomped through the public imagination as monsters from a lost world, as if prehistory had once been filled with creatures designed mainly to look impressive on posters. It was a powerful image, and in its own way an understandable one. When a single thigh bone can be taller than a person, restraint does not arrive naturally. Still, the real story is far more interesting, because dinosaurs were not fantasy beasts. They were living organisms, shaped by evolution, constrained by anatomy, raised by environmental pressure, and guided by the same broad biological rules that govern life today. That shift in perspective changes everything. The moment a dinosaur is treated not as a monster, but as an animal, entirely new questions begin to matter. Not just how big it was, but how it stood. Not just whether it looked frightening, but how it found food, how fast it grew, how it sensed danger, how it reproduced, how it survived injury, how it moved through heat and cold, and how it fit into the ecosystems around it. A large predator is one thing. A large predator that needed oxygen, balance, muscle coordination, usable vision, workable metabolism, and enough food to support its body is something much more real. Reality tends to be less theatrical than myth, but much richer in detail. This is one of the most important corrections in all of paleontology. Dinosaurs were not a single style of creature repeated in different sizes. They were an enormous and varied group that lived for well over 160 million years across changing continents, climates, and landscapes. Some were lightly built runners, some were immense browsers, some were covered in feathers, some carried armour, some nested in colonies, some may have cared for their young, some probably lived fairly ordinary animal lives for long stretches, interrupted only occasionally by the sort of event that ends up in a fossil bed and later in a museum hall. Prehistoric life, like modern life, was not made entirely of drama. A surprising amount of it was likely spent walking, feeding, resting, competing, avoiding trouble, and trying not to become somebody else's inconvenient lunch. The science that reveals this picture did not appear all at once. It was assembled slowly, often from frustratingly incomplete remains, and then refined again and again as methods improved. In the 1840s, Richard Owen coined the name Dinosauria, drawing together several large fossil reptiles under a single label. At the time, the image was already starting to form, but it was only a sketch. Early reconstructions were shaped by limited fossils and limited comparisons. Some of those first interpretations now look charmingly wrong, which is a polite way of saying they resemble ambitious guesses made with admirable confidence. That is not a criticism so much as a reminder that science improves by revision. Each new fossil, each better preserved skeleton, and each improved technique has helped replace broad assumption with finer detail. Today, paleontology is a deeply interdisciplinary science. Fossil bones still matter enormously, of course, but they are only part of the picture. Bone histology, which studies microscopic structure inside fossilized bone, can reveal growth rates and age. Trackways preserve movement across ancient ground and can hint at gait, speed, and group behaviour. Skin impressions can preserve scales, textures, and body covering. Feathers, once thought irrelevant to most dinosaur imagery, now stand near the centre of it. Eggs and nests provide evidence of reproduction and development. Computed tomography scanning allows researchers to look inside fossils without destroying them, revealing internal anatomy, brain cavities, sinus spaces, and growth patterns. Chemical and isotopic studies can sometimes add clues about temperature regulation, diet, or environment. The result is not a perfect window into the past, but it is far more than a pile of bones in a glass case. That work is carried out by institutions across the world, from the Natural History Museum in London to the American Museum of Natural History in New York and the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta. These places do more than display dinosaurs beneath dramatic lighting and the quietly judgmental gaze of school groups. They also support fieldwork, conservation, preparation, imaging, comparative anatomy, and the steady patient labour that turns rock and fragments into scientific knowledge. Most fossil discoveries do not emerge from the ground looking heroic. They arrive cracked, incomplete, compressed, distorted, and stubborn. Someone then has to work out what sort of animal is represented, which bones belong together, how the body fit as a functioning organism, and what evidence can be trusted without wandering off into imaginative nonsense. That last part is especially important. Dinosaurs have always attracted excitement, and excitement has a habit of sprinting ahead of evidence like an overconfident tour guide. The evidence-based picture that has emerged is in many ways stranger than the older myths. The traditional popular version imagined dinosaurs as uniformly reptilian, sluggish in body and simple in mind. Modern research has made that image much harder to maintain. Dinosaurs are now understood through fossils that preserve not only size and shape, but growth, injury, nesting, plumage, behaviour, and environment. Some species show signs of rapid growth. Some reveal bird-like air-filled bones. Some left footprints in groups. Some were brooding over nests. Some carried display structures that would have made perfect sense to another dinosaur and probably looked absurd to everything else. Natural selection has never been especially concerned with elegance by human standards. It has always preferred what works. This is why the title matters. Asking what dinosaurs were really like is not a request for a list of names and sizes. It is a request to replace inherited imagery with biological reality. A dinosaur was not merely a large prehistoric reptile. It was a vertebrate with a specific posture, a particular metabolism or range of metabolic strategies, an evolutionary history, a developmental pattern, a feeding ecology, and a place within a changing world. Even within the same broad group, the differences could be astonishing. A long-necked sauropod, a horned ceratopsian, and a feathered theropod were all dinosaurs, yet they lived in strikingly different ways. Lumping them together too carelessly would be a bit like describing bats, elephants, and penguins as basically the same because all of them are animals, and all of them, in their own way, have had a long day. There is also a deeper reason this subject matters. Dinosaurs help reveal how life responds to time on a scale that is difficult to feel in ordinary life. They rose from relatively modest beginnings, diversified across an enormous span of time, adapted to shifting climates and continents, and produced forms ranging from tiny feathered hunters to some of the largest land animals ever to exist. They were not static icons, they were dynamic populations changing over millions of years. To understand them properly requires attention not just to spectacle, but to process. Evolution, ecology, biomechanics, reproduction, growth, and extinction all meet here, and so the goal is not simply to picture a dinosaur standing in profile against a fern-filled background, looking dramatic for reasons known only to itself. The goal is to reconstruct a world of real animals, animals with bones, muscles, skin, senses, life cycles, and limitations, animals that occupied ecosystems, responded to pressure, and inherited bodies shaped by deep ancestry. Before any particular species can be understood properly, one more question has to be settled with care. What, in anatomical and evolutionary terms, made a dinosaur in the first place? To understand what dinosaurs were really like, it helps to begin with a surprisingly basic question. What exactly was a dinosaur? That may sound almost too obvious to ask, but the answer matters more than it first appears. In ordinary speech, dinosaur is often used as a catch-all word for any large extinct reptile with an inconvenient number of teeth. Popular culture has not always been especially fussy on this point. If it lived a very long time ago, looked dramatic in silhouette, and could plausibly ruin a village, it often ended up filed under dinosaur. Scientifically, though, that is far too broad. Dinosaurs were not all prehistoric reptiles. They were one particular branch of a larger group, and that distinction changes how their history is understood. They belong to a lineage called Archosauria, the archosaurs. This broader group also includes crocodilians, birds, and a range of extinct relatives. That means dinosaurs were closer, in evolutionary terms, to crocodiles and birds than to lizards, snakes, or marine reptiles such as plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs. Those marine reptiles were remarkable animals in their own right, but they were not dinosaurs. Neither were pterosaurs, the flying reptiles that shared much of the Mesozoic world with them. A pterosaur in the sky and a dinosaur on the ground could have lived side by side. But close company is not the same as close ancestry. Prehistoric life was crowded with extraordinary creatures, and not all of them belonged in the same family simply because they looked excellent in an illustrated book. This is where evolutionary classification becomes useful. Modern palaeontology does not sort animals only by surface resemblance. It asks about shared ancestry. That is the foundation of phylogenetics, the study of evolutionary relationships. In this approach, scientists look for branching patterns in descent, grouping organisms into clades. A clade includes an ancestor and all of its descendants. This method became especially influential through cladistics, a formal approach developed and refined by researchers including Jacques Gautier, who helped clarify how evolutionary trees could be built from shared derived traits rather than general similarity alone. In simpler terms, the question is not just who looks alike, but who inherited key features from the same deeper line of descent. Dinosaurs form such a clade. They were a defined evolutionary branch within Archosauria, not a vague aesthetic category for anything ancient and impressive. That may sound dry at first, but it is actually rather helpful. It rescues dinosaurs from being a visual stereotype and places them into real biological history. Once that happens, their bodies can be examined with more care. One of the most important traits was posture. Dinosaurs had limbs positioned more directly beneath the body, giving them an upright stance. This is a major difference from the sprawling posture seen in many other reptiles, where the limbs extend more to the sides. Upright posture allowed for more efficient support and locomotion, especially as body size increased. It is one reason dinosaurs could become such successful land animals across such a vast span of time. That does not mean every dinosaur moved quickly or gracefully. Some almost certainly looked like they had been assembled under mild time pressure. But the underlying body plan was powerful and distinct. The hip region also matters a great deal, which is perhaps not the most glamorous sentence in dinosaur science, but it is an honest one. The structure of the pelvis helps define major dinosaur groups and separates them from many other reptiles. Early paleontologists noticed that dinosaur hips tended to fall into two broad arrangements. One group, the Saurischhians, had a lizard-hipped structure. The other, the Ornithischians, had a bird-hipped arrangement. These names are historical and useful, though they come with a small twist of irony. Birds did not arise from the Ornithischians. They evolved from theropod dinosaurs within Saurischia. Evolution is under no obligation to make its labels convenient. Saurischia included theropods, the mostly bipedal group that later gave rise to birds, along with the long-necked sauropodomorphs, which eventually produced the giant sauropods. Ornithischia included an entirely different array of plant-eating dinosaurs, such as stegosaurs, ankylosaurs, hadrosaurs, and ceratopsians. The distinction is broad rather than trivial. It reflects different body plans, different feeding adaptations, and long separate evolutionary histories within Dinosauria. Modern research has continued to refine these relationships, and there have been newer debates about how the dinosaur family tree should be arranged, especially concerning the earliest branching events. That debate is worth noting because it shows science at work, but the central point remains firm. Dinosaurs were a real evolutionary group with identifiable anatomical traits, not a loose bag of prehistoric celebrities. Other skeletal features helped define them as well. Dinosaurs generally had an open hip socket, a perforated acetabulum, which helped create a more erect limb posture. Their hind limbs and ankle structures also differed in important ways from those of many earlier reptilian groups. In some lineages, the delta pectoral crest on the upper arm was enlarged, offering stronger muscle attachment. The sacrum, where the spine connects to the pelvis, also became more robust. None of these features alone tells the whole story, but together they form part of the anatomical pattern that marks a dinosaur. Classification in paleontology often works like that. It is less like identifying a hat, and more like noticing an entire consistent architecture. This matters because without a careful definition, the story of dinosaurs becomes muddled very quickly. A plesiosaur may look ancient and formidable, but it was a marine reptile with a different ancestry and a different body plan. A pterosaur may seem close at hand, especially since some of them were large enough to make anyone rethink outdoor leisure. But they were not dinosaurs either. Even among land reptiles before the rise of dinosaurs, there were archosaur relatives that shared certain features without belonging to Dinosauria itself. The ancient world was full of near neighbours, cousins, side branches and experiments in form. Dinosaurs were one branch among many, though an extraordinarily successful one. Once that definition is clear, the larger picture sharpens. Dinosaurs were upright archosaurs belonging to a distinct evolutionary clade, divided broadly into ornithischians and saurischians, and separated anatomically from other prehistoric reptiles by a combination of posture, pelvic structure, and skeletal traits. That may sound technical, but really it is the opposite of vague. It grounds the subject. It turns dinosaurs from a blurry cultural image into a real biological category with boundaries, ancestry, and meaning. And with those boundaries in place, another question begins to emerge quite naturally. If dinosaurs were one branch within a larger archosaur world, then what sort of planet did that world occupy? What climates, continents, competitors, and ecological pressures shaped the earliest dinosaurs before they became some of the most successful land animals in Earth's history? Knowing what a dinosaur was anatomically is only part of the picture. A body plan, however distinctive, does not explain itself. No animal appears in isolation, and no lineage rises simply because it happens to possess an interesting hip socket. Dinosaurs emerged into a real world with real climates, real competition, and real ecological pressure. To understand what they were like, it helps to step back from the skeleton and look at the stage on which the earliest dinosaurs first appeared. That stage was the late Triassic, and it was a world both familiar in its basic rules and deeply strange in its details. The Triassic period began after the Permian mass extinction, the most severe extinction event known in the history of complex life on Earth. Roughly 9 out of every 10 marine species disappeared, along with a very large share of land species. Ecosystems were shattered. Food webs collapsed. Entire groups that had once been successful vanished or were reduced drastically. Recovery took a very long time, so when the first true dinosaurs appeared, they did not enter a lush, untouched world waiting politely for them to take over. They arrived in landscapes still shaped by catastrophe, in ecosystems that were rebuilding, shifting, and full of openings as well as danger. This is one of the most important corrections to the usual dinosaur image. Dinosaurs were not instantly dominant. They did not march onto the scene with the confidence of creatures who had already read the end of the story. Early dinosaurs were one group among many. They shared the land with a variety of other archosaurs, with crocodile-line relatives, with synapsids descended from older lineages, and with numerous reptiles occupying their own ecological roles. The late Triassic was crowded with evolutionary experimentation. Dinosaurs were part of that experiment, not yet its obvious winners. The world itself was also arranged very differently. Most of Earth's land was joined into the supercontinent Pangaea. Instead of the separate continents known today, there was one vast connected landmass stretching across enormous distances. Alfred Wegener, long before plate tectonics became fully accepted, argued that continents had once been joined and later drifted apart. Modern plate tectonic theory confirmed that basic picture, and it helps explain why fossils of related organisms can appear on landmasses now separated by oceans. In the Triassic, animals could in principle spread across large connected regions without needing ships, passports, or the patience required for modern airport security. Pangaea had major climatic consequences. Its sheer size meant that large inland areas were far from oceanic moisture, which contributed to strong seasonality and widespread arid conditions in many regions. Much of the late Triassic world was warm, and in some places harshly so. Deserts and dry basins were common. Rainfall could be highly seasonal rather than evenly distributed. Temperatures likely swung more strongly between wet and dry periods in some regions than many people imagine when they picture the age of dinosaurs as one endless steaming jungle. There certainly were greener environments, river systems, floodplains, and vegetated regions, but the world as a whole was not a uniform tropical garden. It was a patchwork of climates and habitats, shaped by latitude, inland distance, elevation, and seasonal circulation. This is where the geological timescale becomes useful, not as a list to memorize, but as a way of seeing dinosaur history properly. The Mesozoic era, often called the Age of Dinosaurs, is divided into three periods: the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. Those names are not decorative labels. They mark long stretches of time with different climates, continental arrangements, plant communities, and animal faunas. The Triassic was the world of early experimentation and recovery. The Jurassic saw the expansion of many dinosaur groups under different environmental conditions, with the breakup of Pangaea beginning to reshape geography more dramatically. The Cretaceous was more complex still, with continents separating further, flowering plants spreading, and dinosaur ecosystems becoming increasingly regionally distinct. A dinosaur from the late Triassic and a dinosaur from the late Cretaceous were separated by tens of millions of years, which is a greater interval than the time separating humans from Tyrannosaurus. Deep time is not just long, it is almost offensively long. That scale matters because it prevents a common mistake. Dinosaurs are often mentally gathered into one enormous mixed crowd, as if Stegosaurus, Triceratops, and Tyrannosaurus all lived together in the same scenic valley, waiting for a documentary narrator to arrive. They did not. The world changed constantly during the Mesozoic, and dinosaur life changed with it. Climate, vegetation, sea level, and continental position all influenced where species lived and how they evolved. Geological organisations such as the United States Geological Survey and the British Geological Survey, along with museum field teams and stratigraphic researchers around the world, help reconstruct those ancient settings by studying sediment, rock layers, fossil distribution, and ancient environments. Dinosaurs are not understood from bones alone. They are understood from context. The late Triassic context suggests a world where the earliest dinosaurs were generally modest in size compared with many of their later descendants. They were often lightly built and relatively small. That alone helps clear away another misleading image. The first dinosaurs were not giant thunder lizards stomping over everything in sight. Many were agile animals living in contested ecosystems. Their rise depended not on immediate supremacy but on persistence, opportunity, and a set of useful traits that became more advantageous as conditions shifted. Competition was intense. Other archosaur groups were abundant and in some places more prominent. Early crocodile line archosaurs occupied roles that later dinosaur groups would fill more fully. This means the success of dinosaurs was contingent rather than inevitable. They were not guaranteed rulers of the land from the moment they appeared. They had to survive in a world full of rivals, environmental instability, and ecological openings that could close as easily as they opened. Evolution rarely hands out crowns in advance. It tends to offer temporary opportunities and then ask whether a lineage can make use of them before something else does. There is something quietly fascinating in that. The creatures later imagined as the default rulers of prehistory began as one branch in a messy and competitive world recovering from disaster. They inherited a planet still reorganizing itself after loss, under a warm and often difficult climate, on a supercontinent whose shape influenced everything from rainfall to dispersal. Their story began not with dominance, but with adaptation, and that adaptation would prove remarkably powerful. Over time, those early dinosaurs would diversify, spread, and gradually occupy a widening range of ecological roles. From those relatively small beginnings would come a lineage astonishing in scale, form, and variety, producing some of the most familiar and unfamiliar animals ever to walk the earth. By the time the first true dinosaurs appeared, the world was not waiting for giants. It was a world of opportunity, certainly, but also one of uncertainty, pressure, and competition. The earliest dinosaurs were not the towering, earth-shaking animals so often imagined when the word dinosaur is mentioned. They were generally smaller, lighter, and far less imposing at first glance than their later descendants. In many cases, they were built for agility rather than sheer mass, for movement rather than spectacle. That makes their eventual rise all the more interesting because it did not begin with overwhelming size or obvious supremacy. It began with modest animals in a shifting world, gradually finding ways to persist while other lineages faltered. This is one of the most useful places to set aside the old public image. The first dinosaurs were not enormous, thunderous rulers striding across every landscape with immediate authority. Many were only a few meters long, and some were smaller still. Eoraptor, one of the early dinosaurs known from the late Triassic of what is now Argentina, was lightly built and relatively small, with a body shaped more for quick movement than for intimidation. Herrerasaurus, from roughly the same broad region and span of time, was larger and more formidable, but still a far cry from the colossal bodies of later theropods and sauropods. Chelophysis, another well-known early dinosaur, was slim, long-legged, and graceful in build, more like a quick, alert predator than a living mountain of muscle. These animals already show diversity, but they do not yet resemble the giant celebrities that usually dominate dinosaur books, museum gift shops, and the imaginations of children who quite reasonably prefer their prehistoric animals to be at least slightly absurd. That early diversity matters. It shows that dinosaurs were experimenting with different lifestyles and body plans from quite near the start, even before they became ecologically dominant. They were not one single design copied over and over. Some were probably carnivorous, some perhaps more flexible in diet, and some belonged to branches that would later give rise to very different forms. Evolution rarely moves in a straight line toward a pre-decided result. It spreads, tests, diverges, and then keeps whatever proves useful under changing conditions. Charles Darwin, in describing natural selection, gave biology one of its most powerful explanatory ideas. Traits that improve survival and reproduction tend to persist over time, not because nature has a grand plan, but because some variations work better than others in the circumstances available. Dinosaurs fit that principle well. Their success was not the result of one magical feature. It emerged from the steady accumulation of advantages interacting with a world that kept changing beneath them. Some of those advantages were anatomical: upright posture, more efficient locomotion, and flexible body plans gave dinosaurs important possibilities on land. Some advantages were ecological. If a lineage can exploit food sources effectively, reproduce successfully, and move well through its environment, that lineage has a chance. But chance is not the same as certainty. For a long stretch of the Triassic, dinosaurs were simply part of the mix. They lived alongside many other archosaurs, especially crocodile line relatives, some of which were highly successful in their own right. In that earlier stage, there was nothing inevitable about dinosaurs becoming the dominant large land animals of the Mesozoic. Another outcome was entirely possible. Evolution is full of paths not taken, and the fossil record is filled with reminders that success is often provisional. Climate played an important role in shaping these possibilities. The late Triassic world was warm, strongly seasonal in many places, and ecologically unstable in the long shadow of earlier mass extinction. Environments changed, habitats opened and closed, water availability shifted, vegetation patterns moved with climate. In such a setting, adaptability mattered. Smaller, mobile animals may have held certain advantages in disturbed or patchy landscapes. Dinosaurs did not yet dominate those landscapes, but they were present within them, responding to the pressures of the world in ways that later positioned them well when larger changes arrived. One of the most important of those changes was the Triassic extinction, which occurred around 201 million years ago. This extinction event was not as devastating as the earlier Permian catastrophe, but it was still severe. Many competing groups declined or disappeared. The causes are linked strongly to massive volcanic activity associated with the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, which released enormous amounts of greenhouse gases and disrupted climate and chemistry on a global scale. That phrase may sound rather clinical, but it describes a planetary upheaval of very serious proportions. Entire ecosystems were stressed. Lineages that had once been common suddenly found themselves in trouble. When extinctions remove established competitors, they do not simply create emptiness, they create ecological space. That phrase, ecological space, is worth pausing over. It refers to available ways of living within an environment, food sources not fully exploited, habitats not fully occupied, roles in ecosystems that can now be filled by survivors. When one set of animals declines, another may expand into those openings. This process is often part of adaptive radiation, in which a lineage diversifies into a range of forms as new ecological opportunities become available. Dinosaurs appear to have benefited enormously from this. They were already present, already varied, and already functioning as competent land animals. When the Triassic extinction reduced some of their rivals, dinosaurs were well placed to expand. That expansion did not happen because dinosaurs suddenly became different overnight. It happened because conditions changed in ways that favoured lineages with certain combinations of traits. Their posture, limb function, growth patterns, and ecological flexibility may have helped them take advantage of new opportunities more effectively than some competitors could. Over time, those advantages compounded. The Jurassic then saw dinosaurs spread into a remarkable array of forms and sizes. Some branches became huge herbivores with long necks and column-like limbs. Others became fast predators. Others developed armour, crests, horns, beaks, display structures, and increasingly specialised ways of living. The vast later richness of Dinosauria grew out of these earlier, humbler beginnings. There is something quietly elegant in that transformation. The first dinosaurs were not impressive because they were already the largest or most dramatic animals on Earth. They were impressive because they were adaptable, they endured, they diversified. They persisted through environmental change and then expanded when opportunity widened. It is a more biological kind of greatness, less theatrical than myth, but far more convincing. Nature often works that way. The future is not always built by the biggest animal in the room. Quite often it is built by the one that can keep functioning while the room itself is being rearranged. This also helps explain why dinosaur history should never be reduced to a single image. There was no instant switch from small, early forms to a world filled with giants. There was a long, unfolding process shaped by selection, extinction, geography, and time. Eoraptor, Herrerasaurus, and Coelophysis were not failed drafts waiting for more famous dinosaurs to arrive. They were real and successful animals within their own moment, part of the early spread of a lineage that would later reshape terrestrial ecosystems across the globe. And once that rise began in earnest, dinosaur bodies themselves start to deserve closer attention. their success was not abstract. It was built into the mechanics of how they stood, balanced, and moved through the world. One of the oldest and most stubborn dinosaur images is the idea that they all moved like oversized lizards, sprawling awkwardly, tails dragging behind them, as if the whole group spent the Mesozoic shuffling around in a permanent state of anatomical inconvenience. It is an image that lingered for a very long time, partly because early reconstructions were working with incomplete fossils, and partly because once an idea becomes familiar, it tends to cling on with surprising determination. But the fossil evidence tells a different story. Dinosaurs did not generally stand with their limbs splayed out to the sides in the way many living reptiles do. Their legs were positioned more directly beneath the body, producing an upright posture that changed everything about how they carried weight, how they balanced, and how they moved across the land. That upright stance is one of the defining features of Dinosauria. It meant the body could be supported more efficiently, especially as size increased. When limbs are tucked under the body, weight is transferred downward in a more stable way. This matters whether the animal is a lightly built runner or a giant herbivore weighing many tons. A sprawling posture can work perfectly well for many animals, especially those living close to the ground, but it becomes less efficient for large, active land animals that need endurance, support, or speed. Dinosaurs in general were built on a more columned and centred plan. They were not all fast, of course. Some were quite possibly the biological equivalent of heavy furniture with opinions, but even the slow ones were not simply enlarged lizards. Their bodies followed a different architectural logic. The hips were central to that logic. In a dinosaur skeleton, the pelvis is not just a place where legs happen to be attached. It is part of the whole mechanical system that organises posture and locomotion. The hip socket, the arrangement of the pelvic bones, and the connection between pelvis and spine all help determine how the body is supported and how force moves through it. This is one reason hips matter so much in dinosaur classification and function alike. A dinosaur's limbs were not hanging off the sides as an afterthought. They were integrated beneath a body built to move with purpose. Balance mattered just as much. Many dinosaurs, especially bipedal forms, depended on careful control of their centre of mass. That phrase simply means the point where body weight is effectively centred. If that point is too far forward or too far back, movement becomes unstable. In bipedal theropods, the long tail played a crucial role here. It acted as a counterbalance to the head and torso, helping stabilise the body over the hips. This meant the animal did not have to drag its tail behind it like a badly packed suitcase. Instead, the tail was typically held off the ground, extended behind the body as a dynamic balancing structure. In many theropods, the vertebrae and stiffening tendons of the tail helped keep it strong and controlled, allowing it to resist unwanted side-to-side wobble, while the hind limbs did the main work of locomotion. The vertebral column as a whole also shaped movement. The spine was not a rigid beam in every dinosaur, nor was it equally flexible in all groups. Different lineages evolved different solutions to different mechanical problems. In a fast-moving predator, the trunk and tail had to coordinate with the legs to support efficient running and turning. In a gigantic sauropod, the spine had to help support an enormous neck, a huge torso, and a great deal of weight over 4 limbs. In heavily armoured dinosaurs, body structure had to accommodate protection, without making movement impossible. The underlying principle is that motion always reflects anatomy. Dinosaurs moved the way they did because their bones, joints, muscles, and body proportions allowed certain actions and limited others. Muscle attachment is part of this story too, even though muscles themselves rarely fossilise well. Bone preserves clues. Ridges, scars, crests, and attachment areas show where major muscles were anchored. From that evidence, paleontologists and biomechanical researchers can reconstruct how limbs were powered and controlled. A femur is not just a thigh bone, it is part of a lever system. A shoulder blade is not just a plate of bone, it is a site of force transmission. When enough of these parts are preserved, and when they are compared with living animals such as birds and crocodilians, The likely range of movement becomes much clearer. Dinosaurs stop looking like static skeletons and start looking like functioning organisms again. That functioning varied enormously across Dinosauria. Some dinosaurs were built for speed. Colophysis and other lightly built theropods had long hind limbs, narrow bodies, and proportions suggesting agility. Later theropods such as ornithomimosaurs, often compared loosely to ostriches, seem to have been particularly well suited to fast running. Their bodies were streamlined, their limbs elongated, and their proportions suggest efficient locomotion over land. Other dinosaurs were not sprinters at all, but they were still highly competent movers within their own ecological roles. Large sauropods such as Diplodocus or Apatosaurus were quadrupeds built for support, long-distance walking, and the steady management of astonishing mass. Their column-like limbs and broad feet were not signs of clumsiness. They were structural solutions to the problem of being enormous without collapsing into a regrettable heap. Ornithischian dinosaurs added even more variety. Hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, could move on all fours but also had the anatomy to rear or move bipedally in some circumstances. Ceratopsians, such as Triceratops, were strong quadrupeds, built more for support, browsing and defence than for elegant speed. Ankylosaurs were low, broad, heavily armoured and stable, with locomotion shaped by the need to carry both body mass and defensive equipment. Stegosaurs had their own distinctive gait and weight distribution, influenced by their limb proportions and spinal shape. There was no single dinosaur way of moving. There were many, each tied closely to body design, habitat and lifestyle. Some of the best evidence for that movement comes not from bones alone, but from footprints. This is where ecology becomes especially valuable. Ecology is the study of trace fossils, including tracks, trails, burrows, and other marks left by living organisms. Dinosaur trackways preserve moments of action on ancient ground. They show how feet met the earth, how far apart steps were, whether an animal was walking or running, whether multiple individuals moved together, and sometimes whether conditions were muddy, dry, or shifting beneath them. Martin Lockley, one of the best-known researchers in dinosaur track studies, helped demonstrate just how much behaviour can be inferred from these traces when they are studied carefully. A trackway can reveal gait, which is the pattern of limb movement during walking or running. It can hint at stride length and therefore offer clues about speed. It can show whether a tail was dragging, and in dinosaur trackways the answer is usually no, which is one more quiet blow against that older image. Some trackways suggest group movement, with multiple individuals travelling in the same direction across the same surface. Others show differences in size that may hint at mixed-age groups. A footprint is not as glamorous as a skull full of teeth, but it has one major advantage. It records an animal in the act of existing. Bones show structure, tracks show behaviour, and behaviour, even in this limited form, helps complete the picture. Dinosaurs were not simply arranged as museum mounts in life, each one obligingly holding a pose for several million years. They walked, turned, shifted weight, navigated terrain, and in some cases moved in groups across open ground or soft sediment. A heavy quadruped would have distributed force very differently from a lightly built biped. A runner would leave a different signature from a browser. A juvenile might move differently from an adult. The ground itself mattered too. Mud, sand, floodplain silt, and damp shorelines each recorded movement differently. Every preserved trackway is therefore a small mechanical conversation between anatomy and environment. All of this makes dinosaurs feel less mythical and more alive. Their success was not just about size, teeth, or longevity. It was about functional bodies. Bodies that could support mass, conserve energy, balance effectively, and move in ways suited to real ecosystems. Some were adapted for endurance, some for bursts of speed, some for heavy support and deliberate walking, and some for flexibility between different modes of movement. That diversity is one of the clearest signs that dinosaurs were not a single kind of animal repeated again and again, but a vast evolutionary radiation shaped by many different physical demands. And once movement is understood more clearly, another layer begins to sharpen. The bones tell one part of the story and the footprints tell another, but neither fully answers what these animals look like on the outside. For that, attention has to shift from the machinery of movement to the surfaces of the body itself, the skin, the covering, the colour, and the surprising appearance many dinosaurs may actually have had. Once the mechanics of dinosaur movement come into view, another question becomes difficult to ignore. What did these animals actually look like from the outside? Bone can tell a great deal about posture, gait, balance, and muscle arrangement, but it does not automatically reveal the surface of the body. A skeleton, however beautifully mounted, is still only the internal frame. For a long time, that missing outer layer was filled in with a fairly simple assumption. Dinosaurs were imagined as uniformly scaly, rather dull in colour, and broadly reptilian in the familiar sense. It was a neat solution, easy to picture and easy to repeat. It also turned out to be far too simple. The fossil record, when preservation is unusually good, offers something much more interesting. Skin impressions can preserve textures and scale patterns. In rare cases, soft tissues and body coverings leave traces fine enough to transform the image entirely. Some fossils preserve feather-like structures directly, others show quill knobs on bone, the attachment points for feathers on the forelimbs, much as they appear in modern birds. Together, these lines of evidence have forced a major revision. Dinosaurs were not all built to the same visual template. Some certainly had scales over much of the body, some had feathers, some likely had a mixture of both, with different coverings on different regions. The old blanket image of the dinosaur as a giant lizard has not survived this evidence particularly well. Few discoveries did more to change that picture than the extraordinary fossils from northeastern China, especially those of the Yixian Formation. This early Cretaceous locality preserved animals in remarkable detail, including impressions of filamentous and more complex feathered coverings. It gave scientists direct evidence that feathers were not exclusive to birds in the narrow traditional sense. Instead, feather-like structures appeared among a range of non-avian theropod dinosaurs. Researchers such as Xu Xing played a major role in describing many of these finds, helping to establish that feathered dinosaurs were not an eccentric side note, but a major part of the real story. Philip Currie also contributed greatly to the growing understanding of feathered theropods and their connection to birds, reinforcing the idea that the boundary between bird and dinosaur was much more porous than older reconstructions had allowed. This did not simply add feathers for decoration, it changed the underlying image of what a dinosaur body could be. Feathers are often mentally tied to flight, but flight is only one possible use for them. In dinosaurs, feathers may have served for insulation, helping smaller bodied species retain heat. They may have been used in display, creating visual signals during courtship, rivalry, or social interaction. They may have helped with camouflage, breaking up the body outline or blending with vegetation and shadow. They may have played a role in brooding eggs or shielding hatchlings. Signalling alone opens a vast field of possibility, because once structures evolve that can be seen clearly, natural selection can start refining them for communication. Nature has never needed much encouragement to invent something visually extravagant. Give evolution enough time and it will produce a feathered tail fan, a bony crest, or a frill shaped like an argument. The important point is that feathers were not an all-or-nothing feature. Some dinosaurs had simple filamentous coverings, more like fuzzy body insulation than the flight feathers of a hawk. Others had branched structures and more elaborate plumage. Large-bodied dinosaurs may have retained scales over broad areas, while smaller theropods often seem more likely to have had extensive feathering. Even within one lineage, the appearance could vary by life stage, body region, or function. Juveniles may have been fluffier than adults. Display feathers may have been concentrated on the arms, tail, or neck. A dinosaur might therefore have looked neither like a modern reptile nor exactly like a modern bird, but like something stranger and more specific to its own evolutionary moment. colour adds another layer of complexity. For a long time, colour in dinosaurs was almost entirely speculative, which meant artists had considerable freedom and occasionally used it with the enthusiasm of people who'd just discovered the paint box. More recently, the study of melanosomes has made some cautious colour reconstruction possible in certain fossils. Melanosomes are microscopic structures associated with pigment, and their shape and distribution can sometimes provide clues about dark, reddish, or patterned coloration. Jakob Winther and colleagues helped pioneer this approach, showing that at least in some exceptional fossils, colour patterns could be inferred with limited but meaningful confidence. This does not mean every dinosaur can now be painted with forensic certainty. Far from it. Most cannot. But it does mean that colour is no longer pure imagination in every case, that caution matters. Melanosomes can suggest likely pigment-related colours, but they do not preserve every aspect of appearance. Bright structural colours, soft tissue shades, iridescence in full detail, and many other features remain difficult or impossible to reconstruct confidently in most species. Even when evidence is strong, it usually applies to one fossil, one body region, or one species rather than the whole dinosaur world at once. Science can recover more than it once could, but it still has limits. That is not a weakness. It is simply honesty. The dinosaurs have not told us everything. They have, however, told us enough to make the older grey-green stereotype feel increasingly flimsy. Skin itself also varied. Some fossils preserve pebbly scales, larger feature scales, or more complex surface textures. Sauropods, hadrosaurs, and other groups preserve evidence that many dinosaurs did indeed have scales over significant parts of their bodies. The modern view is not that feathers replace scales everywhere, but that dinosaur integument was diverse. Integument is the scientific term for the body covering, and in dinosaurs that covering could include scales, filaments, feathers, and combinations of these. The result is a more biologically realistic picture. Dinosaurs were not visually uniform. They were externally varied, ecologically shaped, and in some cases far more bird-like than generations of older artwork had prepared anyone to expect. This changes more than appearance. A feathered body raises deeper biological questions. If many dinosaurs carried insulating coverings, what does that suggest about heat retention, activity levels, and internal physiology? If they looked less like sluggish reptiles, and more like active, dynamic animals with complex coverings and behaviour, then the question of what was happening inside the body becomes impossible to avoid. Once feathers enter the picture, the question of dinosaur metabolism becomes much harder to avoid. A body covering that helps retain heat immediately suggests that heat mattered, and that leads into one of the longest and most lively debates in dinosaur science. Were dinosaurs cold-blooded, like many modern reptiles, relying mostly on external heat sources to regulate body temperature? Were they warm-blooded, generating substantial internal heat like birds and mammals? Or were they something more complicated, occupying a middle ground that does not fit neatly into familiar categories? The answer matters because metabolism shapes almost everything else. It affects growth, movement, feeding demands, geographic range, daily behaviour, and the pace of life itself. For a long time, dinosaurs were commonly portrayed as slow, heavy, and rather lethargic. They were imagined as oversized reptiles whose bodies and habits were governed by low metabolic rates, basking when necessary and conserving energy whenever possible. That view fit comfortably with the old image of sprawling posture and tail-dragging locomotion. If dinosaurs looked like giant reptiles, many assumed they must have functioned like giant reptiles as well. But as anatomy, biomechanics, and fossil evidence improved, that image began to crack. The challenge did not come from one single discovery. It came from many lines of evidence, arriving gradually and then building into a much stronger case that the old stereotype was too simple. Two scientists became especially associated with that shift. John Ostrom, through his work on Deinonychus, helped reveal a dinosaur that looked active, agile, and highly dynamic. Deinonychus did not fit comfortably into the old idea of dinosaurs as sluggish failures of ambition. It looked like an alert, coordinated predator with a body built for rapid movement and precision. Robert Baker pushed these ideas further, arguing that many dinosaurs were much more active and metabolically intense than previously assumed. Together, and alongside other researchers, they helped drive what is often called the dinosaur renaissance, a major change in scientific and public thinking that gathered strength in the late 20th century. Dinosaurs began to be seen less as oversized reptilian relics and more as energetic animals with complex biology, closer in some ways to birds than to the old swamp-bound caricature. One important line of evidence comes from bone histology. When palaeontologists cut thin sections of fossil bone and examine them microscopically, they can see growth patterns, vascularization, and tissue organization. Many dinosaurs show relatively rapid growth compared with most living reptiles. Fast growth usually requires a fairly high and steady energy supply. It is not absolute proof of full warm-bloodedness in the modern mammalian or avian sense, but it does suggest that at least many dinosaurs were not living at the low metabolic pace once imagined. Gregory Erickson and other researchers have used growth studies to show that some dinosaurs grew astonishingly quickly, reaching very large size in surprisingly short spans of time. A giant body built in a hurry tends not to emerge from a physiology devoted mainly to doing as little as possible. Predator-prey ratios also played a role in earlier arguments. In ecosystems with highly active predators, there are typically fewer top predators relative to herbivores because energetic hunters require substantial food. Some researchers noted that certain dinosaur communities seemed more consistent with active predatory lifestyles than with the lower energy demands expected from sluggish reptiles. This line of evidence is not perfect, because fossil assemblages are shaped by preservation bias as well as biology, but it contributed to the broader reassessment. Isotopic studies added another angle. Ratios of oxygen isotopes preserved in bones and teeth can sometimes offer clues about body temperature regulation. Some results have suggested that at least certain dinosaurs maintained fairly stable internal temperatures. Again, caution is necessary. Fossils do not come with a handwritten metabolic diary, but taken together with anatomy, growth, and ecology, isotopic evidence strengthens the case that many dinosaurs had more active physiological systems than once believed. Then there are the dinosaurs that lived in high latitudes. Fossils from ancient polar regions, including what is now Australia and Alaska, suggest that some dinosaurs inhabited environments with long seasonal darkness and cooler conditions. Even during warmer global climates than today, those regions would not have offered endless tropical comfort. If dinosaurs could live and remain active there year-round, that implies a physiology capable of functioning under more demanding thermal conditions. Feathers make that even more interesting. An insulating covering is far more useful if the body beneath it is producing and retaining heat. Insulation on a permanently sluggish animal is rather like putting a winter coat on a chair. It may be technically possible, but it does not achieve very much. Still, the most sensible answer may not be a simple choice between cold-blooded and warm-blooded. Those categories are useful, but life is rarely obligated to fit perfectly inside them. Modern animals already show a range of metabolic strategies. Some fish warm part of the body. Some reptiles can elevate body temperature behaviourally. Large body size itself can help retain heat, a phenomenon sometimes called gigantothermy, in which a very large animal changes temperature more slowly simply because of its mass. A giant sauropod may not have functioned metabolically in exactly the same way as a small feathered theropod. A heavily built herbivore in one climate may not have shared the same physiological profile as a fast-running predator in another. That is probably the key point. Dinosaur physiology likely varied. Small feathered theropods may have been highly active, with relatively elevated metabolic rates and strong internal temperature control. Massive long-necked sauropods may have combined large body size with different thermal dynamics. Ornithischians may have occupied their own range of solutions. over more than 160 million years across many continents and environments, it would be more surprising if all dinosaurs shared one identical metabolic formula than if they differed. Dinosauria was too broad, too diverse, and too long-lived for a single easy label to satisfy every case. So the old question, warm or cold, turns out to be useful mainly because it leads to a better one. Not which one word can be applied to all dinosaurs, but how different dinosaur bodies managed heat, energy, activity, and growth in different ways. That richer question makes more room for the evidence, and less room for inherited clichés. And growth may be the clearest next place to look. Because whatever their precise metabolic strategies were, dinosaurs did not remain fixed from the egg onward. They changed dramatically across life, and in some species the journey from hatchling to adult transformed the animal so much that it could almost look like more than one creature entirely. If dinosaur metabolism raises the question of how much energy these animals could produce and sustain, growth shows where much of that energy went. Dinosaurs were not born in the finished forms seen in museum halls. They began life as embryos inside eggs, emerged as hatchlings, passed through juvenile stages, and only gradually became the adults whose skulls, horns, crests, armour, or towering size tend to dominate the public imagination. That sounds obvious at first, but it matters enormously, because a dinosaur was not one fixed shape from the beginning of life to the end of it. In many species, growth changed proportions, behaviour, diet, and even outward appearance so dramatically that individuals at different ages could look like entirely different animals. That can make the fossil record surprisingly tricky. A hatchling dinosaur was not simply a smaller adult, just as a chick is not merely a miniature ostrich with a shorter to-do list. The skull could be differently proportioned. The limbs could appear longer relative to the body. Ornamentation might be absent, reduced, or not yet fully developed. Bone texture could change with maturity. In some groups, body posture and locomotion may also have shifted as the animal grew heavier and stronger. This means that when paleontologists find fossils of different sizes and shapes, one of the first questions is whether they belong to separate species or to different life stages of the same species. It sounds straightforward in theory, but deep time has a habit of removing the most helpful labels. Bone histology has been one of the most important tools in solving that problem. By examining the microscopic structure of fossil bone, researchers can estimate growth rate, maturity, and sometimes age. Gregory Erickson and other scientists have done especially influential work in this area, showing that dinosaur bones preserve far more information than simple shape alone. Some bones contain growth marks somewhat similar in principle to growth rings in trees, though they are not identical in every detail or every circumstance. These lines can help indicate pauses or seasonal slowdowns in growth. The density of blood vessel channels in bone tissue can also reveal how rapidly an animal was growing. Fast-growing bone tends to look different from slower-growing bone, and those patterns help reconstruct the life history of the animal that once carried it. This matters because growth rate is not a side note. It helps reveal what dinosaurs were really like as living animals. A creature that grows quickly from a vulnerable hatchling into a multi-ton adult is not living at a sluggish biological pace. Rapid growth implies substantial food intake, active internal physiology, and a developmental strategy shaped by ecological pressures. In many species, growing fast would have carried obvious advantages. A small dinosaur is vulnerable to predators, weather, and competition in ways that a larger one is not. If a species can move through that dangerous early period efficiently, it improves its chances of survival. The fossil record suggests that many dinosaurs did exactly that. Tyrannosaurs offer a good example of how much growth could alter the whole feel of an animal. A juvenile tyrannosaur was not simply a pocket version of a massive adult. Younger individuals were more lightly built, with longer legs relative to body size, narrower skulls, and different proportions that may have made them faster and more agile. An adult Tyrannosaurus, by contrast, was massively constructed, with a deep skull, powerful bite, and a body built for overwhelming force. That suggests not just a change in size, but potentially a change in ecological role across life. A younger tyrannosaur may have hunted differently, moved differently, and occupied a somewhat different niche from the fully mature adult. One species could, in effect, change its place in the ecosystem as it aged. Hadrosaurs and cerastopsians tell similar stories in different ways. A subadult hadrosaur may not yet have carried the full crest shape seen in a mature individual, and that matters because crests were likely involved in display, signalling, or sound production, as well as species recognition. In ceratopsians, horns and frills often change significantly during growth. A juvenile could therefore look much less dramatic than the adult form, with the famous ornamentation not yet fully expressed. This is one reason isolated skulls or incomplete specimens can be so frustrating and so fascinating at the same time. The animal may not just be small, it may be unfinished. That unfinished quality has contributed to some famous debates in dinosaur science. One recurring question is whether certain fossils represent valid distinct species or immature individuals of species already known. These arguments can become quite lively, which is perhaps inevitable when the evidence consists of fragmentary fossils, changing bones, and a great deal of professional stubbornness distributed across several institutions. The important point, though, is that growth complicates classification. If anatomy changes substantially through development, then age must be understood before taxonomy can be trusted. A name attached too quickly can later turn out to describe adolescence rather than novelty. The deeper implication is that dinosaurs were dynamic organisms. They developed, transformed, and passed through life stages with real biological consequences. Museum mounts often freeze them into a single idealized moment, usually adulthood, as though that form tells the whole story. But real dinosaurs were once hatchlings with fragile bones and limited abilities. They were juveniles learning to feed, move, avoid danger, and perhaps interact with others. They were subadults still growing into the bodies that later appear so iconic. To see only the adult is a bit like judging an oak tree while refusing to acknowledge the acorn, the sapling, and the long, difficult business of becoming wood. Growth also ties directly back to metabolism. A body cannot grow quickly without energy, and energy cannot be spent without biological mechanisms to acquire, process, and direct it. Histology, growth rates, and changing life stages all reinforce the idea that many dinosaurs were active, developing animals rather than slow-moving monuments made of inertia and teeth. Their bones recurred lives in motion, not simply forms preserved at the end. And once life stages are taken seriously, another question naturally becomes more vivid. If dinosaurs began as eggs and changed so much as they matured, then reproduction, nesting, and the early care of the young become essential parts of the story. The path from embryo to adult does not begin at hatching. It begins before that, in the nest, in the egg, and in whatever forms of parental behaviour shape those first vulnerable moments of dinosaur life. Following dinosaur life backward from adult to juvenile eventually leads to the egg, and this is where the animals begin to feel especially real. Bones can reveal anatomy, movement, and growth, but eggs, nests, embryos, and hatchling clusters bring the story closer to daily life. They show where dinosaurs began, how they reproduced, how their young developed, and in some cases how much care may have been invested in those early stages. For a long time, popular images of dinosaurs left little room for this sort of detail. They were imagined as solitary giants, concerned mainly with feeding, fighting, and occasionally looking dramatic against a stormy sky. Reproduction was treated almost as an afterthought, as though young dinosaurs simply appeared when required, fully committed to the role of being prehistoric. The fossil record has been much less lazy than that. Dinosaur eggshells alone can reveal a great deal. Their microstructure, thickness, pore arrangement, and mineral composition help paleontologists infer nesting conditions, incubation style, and environmental setting. Some eggs were elongated, some were more rounded. Different groups laid eggs with different shell structures, reflecting different reproductive strategies. Clutches can reveal whether eggs were placed in rings, rows, or more tightly grouped arrangements. The spacing of eggs within a nest can hint at how the parent positioned the body while laying or brooding them. In certain cases, embryos preserved inside eggs provide even more direct evidence, allowing researchers to identify the developing dinosaur, compare growth stages, and examine how body form emerged before hatching. Some of the most important nesting discoveries came from North America and are closely associated with Jack Horner. In Montana, evidence linked to Maiasaura transformed understanding of dinosaur family life. The very name Maiasaura means good mother lizard, reflecting the interpretation that these hadrosaurs showed extended parental care. Nests were found in colonies, with repeated spacing suggesting organised nesting grounds rather than random scattering. Hatchlings appeared to have been too underdeveloped to leave the nest immediately, and the bones of juveniles suggested they remained there for some time while growing. That implied repeated feeding and continued attention from adults. It was a remarkable shift in image. Dinosaurs no longer looked like entirely indifferent egg layers, vanishing into the undergrowth without a backward glance. At least some now appeared capable of something much closer to sustained parental investment. That mattered enormously, not only for hadrosaurs but for dinosaur biology more broadly. If some species nested in colonies and returned care to the young, then reproduction was social, seasonal, and behaviourally complex. It also strengthened the growing connection between non-avian dinosaurs and birds. Many modern birds build nests, brood eggs, guard hatchlings, and invest heavily in offspring. Finding similar patterns in dinosaurs does not make them birds in disguise. It does, however, place them more firmly within a continuum of archosaur and especially theropod reproductive behaviour. Mongolia has also been central to this story. The Gobi Desert has yielded exceptional fossil discoveries through major expeditions and collaborations involving the Mongolian Academy of Sciences and international museum teams. Among the most famous examples are nests, eggs, and brooding specimens of oviraptorosaurs. One especially important discovery showed an adult preserved atop a nest in a posture strongly suggestive of brooding rather than egg theft, which was an unfortunate correction for the reputation of Oviraptor. It had been named under the assumption that it was stealing eggs. Later evidence suggested that at least in some cases it was sitting on its own nest, which is a rather dramatic change from villain to parent. The brooding posture itself is revealing. The limbs are positioned around the clutch, in a way that resembles the incubation posture of modern birds, showing not only reproductive care, but also something about body posture, limb mobility, and feather arrangement. Argentina has added its own major contributions, especially through discoveries of nesting grounds and embryonic material from sauropodomorphs and titanosaurs. These sites have revealed broad nesting colonies, sometimes with many clutches spread across the same area. That suggests not only repeated reproductive behaviour, but also the selection of particular nesting environments. The choice of nesting ground matters. Soil type, drainage, vegetation, temperature and protection all shape reproductive success. Eggs are fragile investments. A nest site is not selected casually. Repeated use of certain areas points to behaviour structured by seasonality and environmental suitability. Reproduction also helps reveal timing. If nests occur in colonies or in repeated layers associated with specific sedimentary conditions, they can indicate seasonal breeding patterns. That brings dinosaurs closer still to living animals, whose reproductive cycles are often tightly linked to climate, rainfall, food supply, and daylight. A nesting ground is therefore not just a place where eggs were left. It is evidence of calendar, habitat preference, and life strategy. It tells us that dinosaur lives were not random sequences of feeding and surviving. They were organised around recurring biological needs, one of the most important being the production and protection of the next generation. Embryos and hatchling clusters deepen the picture. When very young individuals are found together, especially near nests, they provide clues about development and early life. Were hatchlings mobile immediately, like young shorebirds that can move soon after hatching? Or were they more dependent, requiring care and provisioning? The answer seems to have varied across different dinosaur groups. That variation is important. Dinosaur reproduction was not one uniform system. Some species may have buried eggs and invested relatively less after laying. Others appear to have nested more openly and stayed with the young for longer. As with movement, body covering and metabolism, diversity is the rule rather than the exception. This reproductive evidence also tells a broader story about behaviour. A nesting colony implies some level of social tolerance, at least seasonally. Brooding implies body control, posture, and often a degree of protection or thermoregulation. Hatchling dependence implies repeated adult presence. Even eggshell pore structure can hint at whether eggs were buried under sediment or vegetation, or exposed more directly to air. All of these details, small on their own, accumulate into a far richer image of dinosaur life. Dinosaurs did not merely hatch. They reproduced through specific strategies shaped by anatomy, environment, and evolutionary history. And perhaps that is the most striking part. Eggs, nests, and hatchlings make dinosaurs feel less like distant icons and more like animals engaged in ordinary biological tasks. They bred, chose sites, guarded clutches, and in some cases likely cared for the young beyond hatching. That is not the behaviour of mythic monsters. It is the behaviour of real animals living within real ecosystems. Once that becomes clear, another question begins to press forward. If some dinosaurs nested together, brooded eggs, and raised young in shared spaces, then how often did they live, travel, or defend themselves in groups beyond the nest as well? Once nests and hatchlings enter the picture, dinosaur life begins to look less solitary than the older myths suggested. Reproduction alone can require tolerance, coordination, timing, and repeated use of shared ground. That naturally raises a wider question. How social were dinosaurs beyond the nest itself? Did they travel in herds, gather in mixed-age groups, defend one another, migrate together, or even hunt cooperatively? The evidence says that at least some dinosaurs did live in groups of one kind or another. But it also says something equally important. Social behaviour is one of the easiest things to exaggerate if caution is not kept firmly in view. The strongest evidence often comes from trackways and bone beds. Trackways can preserve multiple individuals moving in the same direction across the same ancient surface, sometimes at similar speeds and with roughly parallel spacing. That does not automatically prove a complex social bond, but it does suggest that some animals were travelling together at the same time. In certain cases, such as track sites attributed to large herbivores, the evidence looks consistent with coordinated group movement. A herd crossing soft ground leaves a signature different from a chance sequence of isolated passers-by. When step patterns align and body sizes vary in a coherent way, the simplest explanation is often that several individuals were moving together through the same environment. Bone beds add another line of evidence. A bone bed is a deposit containing many fossils together, often from the same or closely related species. Some bone beds are clearly the result of catastrophe, such as drought, flood, mud entrapment, or some other event that killed multiple animals in one place. If those animals are all from the same species and represent a range of ages, that may suggest group living. In other cases, though, the interpretation is much less secure. Water can gather bones from different places. Currents can sort remains after death. A group of skeletons is not always a social group in life. The distinction matters. Fossils record both biology and geology can sometimes create the illusion of friendship where none existed. That is why behaviour-focused paleontology tends to proceed carefully. Researchers such as David Verricchio and others working on dinosaur behaviour have emphasised the need to combine multiple lines of evidence, rather than leaning too heavily on a single dramatic find. Nesting colonies, trackways, age clustering and repeated fossil associations can together build a stronger case for social organisation. One clue alone may only hint. Several clues pointing in the same direction begin to carry more weight. This is especially important when discussing predators, because few subjects tempt the imagination more readily than the idea of coordinated dinosaur pack hunting. The trouble is that a group of predator fossils does not necessarily mean a pack in the modern wolf sense. Several carnivores may be found together because they were feeding at the same carcass, trapped by the same event, or concentrated in one place by water and sediment after death. Even repeated association does not always prove coordinated hunting strategy. Some living predators tolerate each other around food without operating as highly organized social hunters. Komodo dragons, crocodilians, and many birds offer useful reminders that feeding in proximity is not the same as cooperation. So when paleontologists discuss theropod group behaviour, the strongest position is usually the most measured one. Some species may have hunted together at times, some may have tolerated one another around resources, and some may have lived more solitary lives with only occasional aggregation. The fossil record does not justify turning every predator into a prehistoric special operations unit. Herbivores offer somewhat firmer ground in many cases. Large plant-eating dinosaurs may have benefited from moving in groups for protection, navigation, seasonal movement, or access to food and water. A group can improve vigilance, reduce individual risk, and help younger animals remain within a safer social setting. Hadrosaur bone beds, ceratopsian aggregations, and some sauropod trackways have all been used to support the idea that at least certain herbivorous dinosaurs lived or travelled in groups. In some deposits, there are signs of age group clustering, with juveniles together, adults together, or mixed-age populations in ways that suggest real-life structure rather than random accumulation. That does not mean all herbivorous dinosaurs formed permanent herds at all times, but it does make sociality plausible in many cases. Colonial nesting strengthens that interpretation further. If a species returned to the same nesting grounds repeatedly and tolerated many other individuals nearby during reproduction, then some degree of seasonal social behaviour is already established. From there, it is not difficult to imagine broader patterns of temporary gathering, coordinated movement, or migratory behaviour in at least some groups. Migration itself is difficult to prove directly, but large-scale movement in response to season, food, or breeding opportunity is certainly plausible for some dinosaurs, especially in environments where climate varied strongly across the year. Display behaviour may also have shaped social lives. Many dinosaurs carried structures that make little sense as weapons alone, and much more sense as social signals. Horns, crests, frills, and elaborate plumage are often interpreted partly through the lens of display, species recognition, courtship, and competition. A crest on a hadrosaur or a frill on a ceratopsian may have helped with visual communication between individuals. That implies social awareness even where strong group living is harder to prove. Dinosaurs did not need to march in disciplined herds to be socially responsive animals. Many may have lived in looser systems shaped by mating, rivalry, signalling, and periodic gathering. The most realistic picture is probably one of variation. Some dinosaurs likely nested in colonies. Some may have travelled in herds or family groups. Some may have gathered seasonally and then dispersed. Some predators may have shown tolerance or limited cooperation, while others were probably more solitary. Social behaviour was not one fixed dinosaur trait. It was part of the wider diversity of dinosaur life, shaped by ecology, body size, habitat, reproduction, and evolutionary history. Dinosauria was too broad a lineage for every species to share one social template. That variety is a useful reminder that dinosaurs were not all doing the same thing in the same way. Group living, temporary association, and solitary behaviour could all exist within the wider dinosaur world, depending on the species and the circumstances. The fossil record gives glimpses rather than a complete social documentary, but those glimpses are enough to make one point very clear. Dinosaurs were not merely individual skeletons wandering an empty landscape. Many of them interacted with one another in structured and biologically meaningful ways. And once those interactions are taken seriously, the next question becomes much more grounded. If dinosaurs moved, nested, gathered, competed, and sometimes travelled together, then what were they actually doing day by day within their ecosystems? How did they feed? What roles did they fill? And how was their ordinary life shaped by the constant practical business of finding energy and staying alive? Much of dinosaur life, as with life now, was organised around one persistent and rather non-negotiable question. What is there to eat, and how much effort will it take to get it? Food-shaped bodies, behaviour, movement, competition and habitat. It influenced where an animal could live, how fast it could grow, how often it needed to feed, and what sort of anatomy would make survival more likely. Dinosaurs are often divided in the public imagination into two simple camps, the hunters and the hunted, but that is much too blunt to describe a world this varied. Some were herbivores, some carnivores, some likely omnivores, and some appear to have been niche specialists with feeding strategies adapted to very particular resources. Their lives were not defined only by danger, they were defined by ecology. Herbivorous dinosaurs alone covered a remarkable range of solutions. Sauropods, the great long-necked giants, handled the problem of feeding by becoming extraordinarily tall and extraordinarily large. A long neck allowed access to a broad feeding envelope without constant movement of the whole body. That meant a sauropod could gather vegetation over a wide area while standing in one place, which would have been useful when each step involved shifting many tons of animal. Their heads were often relatively small for their body size, and their teeth were generally not built for elaborate chewing. Instead, many sauropods seem to have cropped plant matter and processed it further down the digestive system. That implies an enormous gut volume, giving food time to ferment and break down. In other words, part of the feeding strategy was simply to become a very large walking fermentation system. Nature does occasionally solve complex problems with elegant refinement. It also occasionally solves them by building an enormous torso and hoping the microbes will be cooperative. Hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, followed a different route. Many had sophisticated dental batteries with large numbers of tightly packed teeth, arranged in ways that allowed continuous replacement and complex grinding surfaces. As older teeth wore down, new ones came into place. This system made hadrosaurs highly effective processors of plant material, able to chew more thoroughly than many earlier herbivorous dinosaurs. Their jaws and skulls were built to support repeated, efficient oral processing, which likely allowed them to exploit a wide range of vegetation. A hadrosaur was not simply swallowing leaves and trusting fate, it was doing the hard work up front. Ceratopsians, including animals such as Triceratops, had their own approach. Their sharp beaks were well suited to cropping vegetation, and their cheek teeth formed powerful slicing batteries that could shear tough plant matter. The large skull, strong jaw musculature, and broad feeding apparatus suggest a highly capable herbivore adapted for dealing with fibrous material. Different ceratopsians may have focused on different feeding heights or plant types, depending on skull shape, body size, and habitat. Even among herbivores sharing the same general landscape, there was likely niche partitioning, with different species reducing direct competition by feeding in different ways or on different plant parts. Plant life itself changed across the Mesozoic, and dinosaurs changed with it. In the Triassic and much of the Jurassic, conifers, cycads, ferns, ginkgos and horsetails were important components of terrestrial vegetation. Later, in the Cretaceous, flowering plants began to spread and diversify. That shift did not instantly remake all dinosaur diets, but it altered the ecological backdrop in important ways. Different plants vary in toughness, nutritional value, chemical defense, height, and seasonal availability. A world of conifers and ferns presents different feeding challenges from one increasingly rich in flowering plants. Tooth shape, jaw mechanics, neck posture, and gut strategy all had to interact with that changing botanical reality. Carnivorous dinosaurs were just as diverse in their feeding strategies. Theropods range from small, agile hunters to giant apex predators. Some had blade-like teeth suited to slicing flesh. Others had different tooth forms suggesting different prey preferences or feeding methods. Tyrannosaurus had a famously powerful bite and robust teeth able to puncture bone, crush tissue, and handle large prey with astonishing force. Functional morphology, the study of how anatomical structures work, has been central to understanding such feeding systems. Researchers such as Emily Rayfield have used biomechanical methods to reconstruct bite force, skull loading, and jaw performance in dinosaurs, showing that skulls were not just shaped dramatically for display, they were engineered by natural selection for particular mechanical tasks. That approach helps turn fossils into working systems. A jaw is not merely decorative, it is a lever. Teeth are not ornaments, they are tools. They are neck muscles, skull joints, tooth wear, and bone strength all contribute to the question of what an animal could actually do with its mouth once it reached the food. In some theropods, the skull and neck seem adapted for powerful bites and tearing motions. In others, speed and agility may have mattered more. Some smaller theropods may have focused on prey that was itself small, fast, or abundant. The dinosaur world did not contain only giant predators chasing giant herbivores across dramatic plains. It also contained countless smaller interactions, quick pursuits, opportunistic feeding, scavenging, and local specialization. Omnivory is harder to prove in many extinct animals, but it is likely that at least some dinosaurs were not strict specialists. Diet in real ecosystems can be flexible, especially when food availability changes by season, age, or habitat. A juvenile may eat differently from an adult. A small theropod might take insects, small vertebrates, eggs, carrion, or plant material depending on circumstance. Beaks, simple teeth, gut contents where preserved, coprolites, and where patterns all help build dietary interpretations, though often with some uncertainty. The safest picture is one of variety rather than rigid categories. Habitat shaped all of this. Floodplains, forests, river margins, semi-arid interiors, coastal environments, and seasonal landscapes would each have offered different food resources. A long-necked browser, a low-grazing herbivore, and a fast-moving predator could all inhabit the same general region while living very different daily lives. Competition made specialization useful. If several large herbivores shared the same environment, they would benefit from using different feeding heights, plant types, or digestive strategies. If multiple predators overlapped, they might reduce competition by targeting different prey sizes or feeding in different ways. Ecology is often less about raw dominance than about avoiding costly overlap. So when asking what dinosaurs ate and how they lived, the answer is not simply plants or meat. It is anatomy meeting environment. It is teeth, jaws, gut capacity, neck length, body size, and landscape all interacting at once. Dinosaurs were not generic hunters or generic prey animals. They were ecological participants shaped by resource use, competition, and adaptation. Their days were structured by feeding, movement, digestion, and the constant business of turning available energy into survival. And once food enters the story fully, the harder edge of dinosaur life becomes clearer as well. Feeding was not merely a technical problem. In many cases, it was a dangerous one because every tooth, horn, beak, claw, and armoured flank belonged to a larger world of pursuit, defence, injury, and survival. Feeding becomes most dramatic when something does not wish to be eaten. That basic fact shaped dinosaur bodies in countless ways. Predators and prey were not separate stories unfolding in isolation. They were part of the same ecological pressure, each influencing the other over long stretches of time. This is the idea of predator-prey coevolution. A hunter that becomes faster, more precise, or more powerful applies pressure to the animals it hunts. Those prey animals, in turn, are favoured if they become harder to catch, harder to wound, or harder to kill. Over many generations, this back and forth can shape anatomy with extraordinary force. Teeth, claws, horns, armour, body size, speed, vigilance, and camouflage are not random decorations scattered across the dinosaur world. They are solutions to problems set by other living animals. Predatory dinosaurs show this clearly. Theropods carried bodies suited in many cases for pursuit, attack, or forceful feeding. Dromaeosaurs, with their grasping forelimbs, flexible bodies, and enlarged sickle-shaped claws on the feet, were equipped in ways that suggest active predatory behaviour, though the exact use of that claw is still debated. It may have helped pin prey, stabilise the body during attack, or aid in climbing or gripping, rather than simply serving as a dramatic stabbing device in the most theatrical sense. Tyrannosaurus took a different route. Instead of relying on narrow slashing jaws, it developed one of the most powerful bites known among terrestrial animals, with thick teeth able to puncture deeply and withstand tremendous forces. These were not delicate blades designed for elegance, they were robust tools for overwhelming resistance. But predators are only half the picture. Defensive anatomy among dinosaurs was just as striking. Ceratopsians such as Triceratops carried horns and broad frills that likely served multiple purposes. Some of those purposes were probably social, including display and recognition, but defense cannot be dismissed. A large horned skull aimed toward an attacker would have been a serious obstacle. Ankylosaurs took defense in another direction entirely. Their bodies were low, broad, and heavily armoured with osteoderms, bony plates embedded in the skin. In some species, the tail ended in a massive club built from fused bone and reinforced structure. That was not a decorative flourish. It was a serious weapon capable of delivering powerful blows, especially to the limbs of an attacker. There are few clearer signs that life in dinosaur ecosystems could become physically direct in a hurry. Even size itself could be a survival strategy. A giant sauropod was not armoured in the way an ankylosaur was, but sheer mass changes the rules of danger. A predator that might attack a juvenile or smaller species would have faced a very different problem when confronting an adult animal weighing tens of tons. Height, bulk, long reach, and the ability to strike with the tail all matter. Large herbivores may not have needed to outrun danger if they could instead become too costly to attack. In ecological terms, that is a perfectly respectable strategy, even if it does amount to becoming a walking argument against opportunism. Speed mattered too, though not equally for every group. Some dinosaurs likely depended on quick acceleration or sustained running to escape predators or capture prey. Others may have relied more on alertness, habitat choice, or group vigilance. Group living can itself function as defense. More eyes mean more chances to spot danger early. Juveniles in a herd may benefit from numbers and positioning. Even loose aggregation can reduce individual risk. None of this requires romanticizing dinosaur social life into organized military formations. It simply recognizes that in many living ecosystems, animals gain survival value from not being alone, and dinosaurs were part of that general biological reality. Camouflage is harder to prove directly, but it is likely to have mattered in at least some species. If feathers or skin patterns helped break up the body outline, especially in smaller dinosaurs or juveniles, that could have provided real protection or hunting advantage. Recent work on melanosomes and preserved body coverings has made it easier to imagine some dinosaurs as visually patterned rather than uniformly dull. A smaller theropod or juvenile herbivore moving through broken light and shadow may not have advertised itself nearly as helpfully as the old grey museum stereotype suggests. The fossil record also preserves the aftermath of violence. Healed bite marks, damaged armour, infected wounds, broken ribs, and injured tails all show that encounters between animals were not theoretical. They happened. Some individuals survived them. A healed injury means the animal lived on after the event, sometimes for a considerable period. Embedded teeth found in fossil bone provide especially vivid evidence. In some cases, a tooth from a predator remains lodged in the skeleton of another animal, leaving a direct sign of contact. Tail injuries in ankylosaurs, damaged frills in ceratopsians, and bite-marked bones in large herbivores all suggest a world where survival often involved actual force rather than abstract ecological roles. Even so, Caution matters. Not every injury came from predation. Some may have resulted from intraspecific combat, accidental trauma, or environmental hazards. Horns and frills, for example, may have been used as much against rivals of the same species as against predators. Damage to skulls and facial bones in ceratopsians may reflect combat over mate's territory or status. A dinosaur's life was dangerous in more ways than one. A predator was one problem. Another member of the same species in a foul mood may have been another. This is why evidence-based reconstruction matters so much. Tyrannosaurus was certainly powerful, but that does not mean every encounter ended in a dramatic full-speed chase across an open plain. Ankylosaurus had a formidable tail club, but the exact way it used that weapon in life must still be inferred from anatomy and comparison, not witnessed directly. Dromaeosaurs were likely active predators, but whether they hunted cooperatively in sophisticated packs remains uncertain. Triceratops had horns that could have deterred predators, but they also likely played roles in display and competition. The truth is usually more interesting than the extreme versions. Dinosaur bodies were shaped by multiple pressures at once, with many structures serving more than one purpose. That is the deeper value of predator-prey coevolution as an idea. It reminds us that no body part evolved in isolation from the living world around it. A tooth makes sense in relation to flesh, bone, escape, and resistance. Armour makes sense in relation to impact, force, and vulnerability. Speed makes sense in relation to pursuit and evasion. A dinosaur body was a record of ecological pressure written in bone, muscle, and skin. And once those pressures are understood, another question becomes more important. To hunt, flee, display, or defend effectively, an animal has to detect the world around it. It has to see, hear, smell, balance, and in some form make decisions. That brings attention from claws and horns to something less obvious, but just as revealing. The senses, the brain, and the question of how perceptive dinosaur life may really have been. Claws, horns, teeth, and armour can only do so much on their own. An animal also has to notice the world in time to use them. It has to detect movement, judge distance, recognise food, sense danger, keep balance while turning, and respond to changing conditions with something more useful than blind panic. That makes the senses central to understanding what dinosaurs were really like. They were not simply bodies moving through space. They were perceiving organisms, each interacting with the world through a particular set of sensory priorities, shaped by anatomy, ecology, and behaviour. This is where palaeontology becomes especially valuable. Palaeontology is the study of ancient nervous systems, usually approached through the structures that fossil bones preserve around the brain and sensory organs. Dinosaurs did not leave soft brains behind in any helpful abundance, which is probably just as well because that would raise several new questions nobody needs at bedtime. What they did leave were skulls. Those skulls contain cavities, canals, openings, and surfaces that preserve indirect but useful information about the organs once housed within them. By studying endocasts, inner ear structures, eye socket size, cranial nerve pathways, and the spaces associated with hearing and smell, scientists can reconstruct at least part of how different dinosaurs sense their surroundings. An endocast is essentially a natural or digital model of the internal cavity of the skull where the brain once sat. It does not preserve the brain itself in full detail, but it provides clues about shape, relative proportions, and the arrangement of major regions. With modern computed tomography scanning, researchers can build highly detailed digital endocasts without damaging the fossil. Lawrence Whitmer and colleagues have been especially influential in this area, using cranial imaging to reconstruct sensory anatomy in extinct archosaurs, including dinosaurs. This work has helped move the discussion away from vague guesses and toward more grounded interpretations of smell, balance, hearing, and visual processing. Vision seems to have been especially important in many dinosaurs, though not equally across all groups. Large eye sockets can indicate relatively large eyes, and the orientation of those eyes matters too. In some predatory theropods, forward-facing eye placement suggests a degree of binocular vision, which would have improved depth perception. That is useful for judging distance during pursuit, striking accurately, or navigating a complex environment at speed. A predator that misjudges distance repeatedly tends not to enjoy a long and successful career. Some theropods therefore appear to have been visually well equipped, relying heavily on sight to detect prey, track motion, and coordinate movement. But not every dinosaur needed the same sensory priorities. Some may have invested more heavily in smell. The olfactory bulbs which process scent information can sometimes be inferred from end-cast structure, and in certain theropods they appear relatively well developed. That suggests scent played an important role in locating food, recognizing territory, finding mates, or identifying carcasses. Tyrannosaurus, for example, has often been discussed as having a strong sense of smell, though popular descriptions sometimes run ahead of the evidence with rather too much enthusiasm. The more careful conclusion is that at least some large theropods seem to have possessed significant olfactory capability, likely useful in both active hunting and scavenging. Hearing is more difficult to reconstruct, but skull anatomy and the structure of the inner ear can provide clues. The length and shape of the cochlear duct in close relatives and fossil forms may indicate sensitivity to certain frequencies. Dinosaurs that engaged in visual display, vocal signalling, or group living may well have relied on sound more than the fossil record can show directly. Hadrosaurs are especially interesting here because some species had elaborate cranial crests connected to nasal passages, and these have been interpreted as potential resonance structures. That suggests not only display but also sound production and acoustic communication. A dinosaur landscape may therefore have been more sonically complex than the silent skeletons in museum halls would suggest. The inner ear also helps with balance and head coordination. The semicircular canals are fluid-filled structures involved in sensing rotation and maintaining equilibrium. Their shape can provide clues about how an animal held its head and how sensitive it may have been to certain movements. In agile predators, precise head control would have mattered greatly. A quick-moving theropod needed to keep visual focus stable, while the body accelerated, turned, or struck. In large herbivores, balance still mattered, but perhaps in different ways, relating more to steady locomotion, head carriage, and environmental awareness than to rapid predatory maneuvers. The point is not that one style of sensory system was better than another. It is that different lifestyles favoured different forms of sensory investment. That leads naturally into the question of intelligence, which is one of the easiest dinosaur subjects to mishandle. Intelligence is difficult enough to define in living animals, where behaviour can be observed directly. In extinct animals, it becomes even more complicated. A larger brain does not automatically mean higher intelligence in any simple human sense. Nor does a smaller brain imply behavioural simplicity. Different animals solve different problems, and brain organisation matters at least as much as size alone. What paleontologists can say with more confidence is that some dinosaurs appear to have had sensory and neural systems suited to active, responsive lives. They were not mindless automata walking from one patch of vegetation to another in a state of geological confusion. Small theropods, especially those closely related to birds, likely had relatively sophisticated sensory integration. Their coordination, vision, and balance systems suggest active control of movement and close interaction with the environment. Herbivores, meanwhile, may have emphasized vigilance. A broad field of view, sensitivity to movement, and the ability to monitor surroundings would be highly useful for large prey animals living among predators. That does not make them less intelligent. It simply means their evolutionary priorities were different. A ceratopsian did not need to think like a dromaeosaur, any more than a modern antelope needs to think like a falcon. Each needed the sensory equipment suited to its own problems. This is one of the most important corrections to the old image of dinosaurs as a single category of creature. There was no one dinosaur mind. There were many sensory worlds: a heavily visual predator, a scent-oriented hunter, a crested herbivore communicating across a group, and a cautious grazer scanning for danger would all experience the world differently. Their brains and senses were shaped by what mattered to their survival, not by any universal ladder of intelligence climbing neatly upward toward a single ideal. Evolution does not build toward prestige. It builds toward function. The more these details accumulate, the more dinosaurs begin to feel like real participants in their environments, rather than oversized props from a vanished age. They saw, smelled, heard, balanced, recognized, and responded. They were neither dull-witted lizards nor tiny feathered philosophers contemplating existence beside a cycad. They were animals with sensory systems fitted to real ecological demands, sometimes subtle, sometimes specialized, and often more capable than older stereotypes ever allowed. And once those individual sensory worlds are brought into focus, the next step is to widen the view again. No dinosaur lived alone in a vacuum of ferns and dramatic weather. Each species existed within a larger community of plants, competitors, predators, scavengers, waterways, soils, and climates, all combining into ecosystems far more intricate than any single skeleton can show. Once senses and behaviour are brought into view, the dinosaur world stops looking like a parade of separate famous animals and starts looking more like what it really was, an ecosystem. No dinosaur lived alone, and no species made sense in isolation. A predator depended on prey, prey depended on vegetation, vegetation depended on climate, water, soil, and sunlight, and all of it unfolded within a broader living community that included much more than dinosaurs. The Mesozoic world was crowded. It contained crocodile relatives, early mammals, insects, fish, amphibians, turtles, lizards, pterosaurs in the sky, and a vast range of plants shaping every level of the landscape. Even the most iconic dinosaur was only one participant in a network much larger than itself. This is where paleoecology becomes especially useful. Paleoecology is the study of ancient ecosystems, and it asks not just what organisms existed, but how they interacted with one another and with their environment. It pulls together fossils, sediment, plant remains, isotopes, trackways, and geological setting to reconstruct something closer to a living community. A skeleton alone can tell what an animal was built like. Paleoecology helps explain where it lived, what surrounded it, what it likely ate, what may have eaten it, and what seasonal pressures shaped its existence. It restores context, which is often the difference between a dramatic fossil and a believable world. One of the clearest lessons from paleoecology is that dinosaurs lived within food webs, not simple chains. A food web is more realistic than a straight line because it allows multiple connections. Plants supported herbivores, certainly, but not all herbivores fed on the same plant types or at the same height. Predators fed on herbivores, but also on smaller prey, juveniles, carrion, and sometimes one another. Insects fed on plants, dead tissue, and dung. Small mammals took seeds, insects, eggs, and other resources. Fish occupied rivers and lakes, while amphibians and reptiles used wetlands, margins, and floodplains. Even decomposition mattered. Dead organisms fed scavengers, microbes, and invertebrates, returning nutrients to the environment. There was no such thing as an isolated giant simply striding through an empty fern forest, with no administrative dependence on the rest of life. Niche partitioning was one of the main ways these crowded systems functioned. A niche is not just a place but a role, including diet, behaviour, habitat use and timing. When several large herbivores lived in the same formation, they likely reduced direct competition by feeding differently. One might browse high vegetation, another crop lower growth, another focus on tougher or more fibrous plants. Differences in skull shape, neck length, tooth wear, and body posture all support this idea. Predators could divide the ecological space as well, with some focusing on large prey, others on smaller animals, and still others taking a more opportunistic role. Without niche partitioning, ecosystems become unnecessarily crowded and costly. Evolution generally rewards less overlap when alternatives are available. Habitat diversity made this even more complex. A single formation could contain river channels, floodplains, lake shores, wooded patches, open ground, and periodically dry zones, each supporting different combinations of organisms. A dinosaur living near a river margin would experience a different daily world from one moving across more open, seasonally dry country. Water availability shaped plant communities. Plant communities shaped herbivore distribution. Herbivore distribution influenced predator presence. Even insects would have varied with moisture, vegetation, and decay. The landscape was not a flat stage painted green. It was a patchwork of habitats, each with its own pressures and opportunities. Field formations are especially important because they preserve these broader communities in a way that allows reconstruction. The Morrison Formation of the late Jurassic in the western United States is one of the best-known examples. It preserves sauropods, theropods, stegosaurs, fish, crocodile relatives, turtles, mammals, and plant remains across a large region. It is not important simply because it contains famous names such as Diplodocus, Allosaurus, and Stegosaurus. It matters because it records an ecosystem with rivers, floodplains, seasonal variation, and interacting species. The same is true of the Hell Creek Formation from the end of the Cretaceous, which preserves Tyrannosaurus, Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, small mammals, fish, amphibians, crocodilians, insects, and abundant plant evidence. Hell Creek is not just the last act of the dinosaurs. It is a living ecological system caught near a major boundary in Earth's history. The Dinosaur Park Formation in Alberta offers another rich example. There, paleontologists have reconstructed communities containing hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, ankylosaurs, tyrannosaurids, dromaeosaurs, crocodilians, turtles, fish, and many smaller organisms in a warm, productive environment shaped by rivers and coastal influence. The value of such formations lies in the density of ecological detail. They show that dinosaur communities were structured, diverse, and locally specific. A famous species in one formation might have no direct equivalent in another. Even when broad groups recur, the exact ecological mix changes. None of this reconstruction happens by accident. Scientific bodies, geological surveys, and museum-led field teams play a major role in turning scattered fossils into environmental understanding. The United States Geological Survey, the Geological Survey of Canada, the British Geological Survey, and many university and museum expeditions help document rock layers, ancient river systems, soil horizons, volcanic ash beds, and fossil distribution. Museums do far more than arrange skeletons under dramatic lighting. They support excavation, sediment analysis, mapping, preparation, imaging, and comparison across thousands of specimens. Paleoecology depends on that patient work, because ecosystems are rebuilt from many small pieces rather than one spectacular fossil. The most important result of all this is perspective. A giant dinosaur did not dominate its world by size alone. It depended on plants, seasons, waterways, breeding grounds, and the presence or absence of competitors. A predator depended on healthy prey populations. A nesting colony depended on suitable ground, climate, and safety. Even a scavenger depended on death arriving in useful places at useful times, which is not the most glamorous ecological role, but it is a valid one. Every dinosaur lived inside a system of constraints and connections. That makes the dinosaur world feel less mythical and more alive. It was not made of isolated stars. It was made of communities, each filled with interacting species and shaped by place. And as those places changed through time, especially as continents drifted apart and climates shifted, the ecosystems changed with them, producing new combinations of dinosaur life across the planet. Once local ecosystems come into focus, a larger truth begins to emerge. There was no single dinosaur world. There were many dinosaur worlds, spread across changing continents, climates and landscapes over more than 160 million years. The familiar habit of placing all dinosaurs together in one imaginary setting is understandable but deeply misleading. Tyrannosaurus did not know Stegosaurus. Triceratops never wandered past Diplodocus. Spinosaurus did not stalk the same wetlands as Velociraptor. These animals were separated not just by distance, but often by tens of millions of years, by shifting climates, and by entire continental rearrangements. Deep time and geography both matter, and once they are taken seriously, dinosaurs begin to look less like a single cast of recurring characters and more like a succession of evolving faunas across a restless planet. Biogeography helps explain this. Biogeography is the study of how species are distributed across space and time, and in dinosaur science it is inseparable from plate tectonics. As the continents moved, collided, separated and drifted apart, populations were isolated or reconnected, climate belts shifted, sea levels rose and fell, inland seas divided landmasses, mountain building altered rainfall and habitat. All of that shaped where dinosaurs could live and how they evolved. A population cut off on one landmass might follow a different path from its relatives elsewhere, eventually producing distinct regional faunas. Geography was not a background detail. It was one of the great engines of dinosaur diversity. In the Triassic, much of Earth's land was still joined in Pangaea, which allowed wide dispersal across connected terrain. Early dinosaurs and their close relatives could spread across broad regions that would later become South America, North America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Antarctica, and Australia. But as the Jurassic and Cretaceous progressed, that connected world began to break apart. The opening of oceans and the separation of land masses gradually divided populations and created new ecological pathways. Dinosaurs did not simply persist through this process, they were shaped by it. North America, for example, hosted very different dinosaur faunas at different times, and even within the late Cretaceous it was partially divided by the Western Interior Seaway, a vast inland sea that split the continent into eastern and western landmasses. Western North America, often called Laramidia in this context, preserved a particularly rich late Cretaceous dinosaur record, including tyrannosaurids, ceratopsians, hadrosaurs, and ankylosaurs. These communities were not generic. They were local, regionally structured, and responsive to changing sea levels, river systems, and vegetation. South America tells a different story. It became one of the most important regions for understanding Gondwanan dinosaurs, the southern landmass fauna that developed separately from those of the north. Giant sauropods such as Argentinosaurus, predatory abelisaurids such as Carnotaurus, and a range of unusual theropods show that South America was not merely a variation on North America, with different scenery. It had its own evolutionary experiments, its own ecological structures, and its own remarkable lineages. South American paleontological teams, especially in Argentina, have been central to revealing this diversity, with research institutions and fieldwork programs helping transform knowledge of Gondwanan dinosaur evolution over the past several decades. Asia was equally distinctive, and in some ways even more surprising. Northeastern China, with formations such as the Yixian, preserved feathered dinosaurs in exceptional detail, changing the global picture of dinosaur appearance and bird evolution. The Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology in Beijing has played a major role in studying these fossils and reshaping understanding of theropods, early birds, and body coverings. Mongolia, especially the Gobi Desert, has preserved rich Cretaceous faunas including oviraptorosaurs, dromaeosaurs, ankylosaurs, and nest sites that have illuminated reproduction and behaviour. Asia was not simply another location for familiar species. It was a major centre of its own evolutionary radiations. Africa adds yet another pattern. During parts of the Mesozoic, its dinosaur faunas included giant predators such as Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus, along with huge sauropods and a variety of other archosaurs in environments ranging from river systems to broad floodplains. The northern African record, though patchier in some intervals than that of North America, still reveals ecosystems shaped by warm climates, extensive waterways, and distinct predator guilds. Spinosaurus in particular shows how misleading it can be to imagine all theropods following the same ecological script. Its anatomy suggests strong adaptation to life associated with water, which already tells a more regionally specific and ecologically unusual story. Europe, often fragmented into islands during parts of the late Cretaceous, produced its own distinctive faunas, including island forms shaped by limited space and isolation. In such settings, body size itself could change dramatically. Some dinosaurs became smaller through a process often called insular dwarfism, an evolutionary response seen when resources are limited on islands. That is a useful reminder that dinosaur evolution did not always move toward larger size. Geography could push in the opposite direction when conditions demanded it. Antarctica and Australia challenge another common stereotype by showing that dinosaurs also lived in high-latitude environments. During the Mesozoic, these regions were not frozen in the modern sense, but they still experienced long seasonal darkness and cooler conditions than tropical zones. Dinosaurs living there had to cope with unusual light cycles and challenging climates. Fossils from Australia and Antarctica demonstrate that dinosaur life was not restricted to warm, fern-draped settings of endless summer. Some populations endured environments that would have seemed demanding, even in a greenhouse world. Dispersal is part of this story too. Continents did not become isolated all at once, and temporary land connections could allow some groups to expand into new regions. Sea levels changed, climates fluctuated, and habitats opened or closed across time. That means dinosaur biogeography was not static. It was a moving pattern of isolation, expansion, and reorganization. Fossil distribution reflects that history, though always imperfectly, because the rock record itself is uneven. Some regions preserve more than others, some environments fossilize better than others. Yet even with those limitations, the broad message is very clear. Dinosaur diversity was geographically structured on a global scale. That global structure makes the old blended image of dinosaur life feel even less convincing. There was no universal dinosaur community spread unchanged across the Mesozoic. There were regional faunas, local ecosystems, shifting barriers, and long intervals of independent evolution. A dinosaur in what is now Argentina inhabited a different world from a dinosaur in what is now Mongolia, even if both belonged broadly to familiar groups. Geography, climate, and history gave each place its own character. And once that is recognized, an even more revealing question appears. If dinosaurs could occupy such a wide variety of regions and be shaped so strongly by place, then some of them must have endured conditions that push well beyond the usual clichés. Not every dinosaur lived in lush warmth beneath giant conifers. Some lived in environments that were darker, drier, colder, or more demanding than the old stereotype ever allowed. By the time dinosaur life is viewed across the whole planet, one thing becomes very clear. These animals were not confined to one comfortable, endlessly green version of prehistory. They lived in a wide range of environments, and some of those environments were demanding enough to overturn the old idea that dinosaurs belonged only in warm, swampy, fern-filled worlds, where everything looked pleasantly dramatic and somewhat damp. In reality, dinosaur life extended into polar regions, dry interiors, floodplains that change with the seasons, coastal margins, river systems, and landscapes that could shift between abundance and hardship. That breadth matters because an animal's true nature is often revealed most clearly at the edges of what it can tolerate. Polar dinosaurs are among the best examples. Fossils from what is now Australia and Alaska show that some dinosaurs lived at very high latitudes, far from the equatorial warmth that still dominates many popular reconstructions. During the Mesozoic, these polar regions were warmer than they are today, so this was not a world of ice sheets and modern Antarctic conditions. Even so, high latitude still meant long periods of winter darkness, lower average temperatures, strong seasonality, and ecological stress that tropical dinosaurs would not have experienced in the same way. Life in such places required more than simply being large and ancient-looking. It required flexibility. The Australian record has been especially important in this respect. Fossils from Victoria, including small ornithopods and other dinosaurs from ancient polar environments, suggest that some species were living in conditions with extended dark winters. These were not casual visits. These animals appear to have inhabited such environments as part of their ordinary lives. That raises interesting biological questions. Did they remain active year-round, or did they alter behaviour seasonally? Did smaller species depend on insulation, perhaps through feather-like coverings to retain body heat? Did they change feeding ranges or activity patterns during darker months? The fossil record cannot answer every detail, but it makes one point difficult to escape. Dinosaurs were capable of occupying environments that demanded real physiological and behavioural resilience. Alaska provides a similarly important window. Late Cretaceous fossil sites there preserve hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, tyrannosaurs, and smaller theropods living at high latitude. These animals inhabited ecosystems with strong seasonality, including long intervals of reduced winter light. That does not automatically mean all of them lived through deep cold in exactly the same way, but it does challenge any simple picture of dinosaurs as animals dependent on uniformly warm, stable environments. A large hadrosaur in high-latitude North America was dealing with a different ecological calendar from a dinosaur in a low-latitude floodplain. Food availability, daylight migration pressure, and thermal demands would all have shifted accordingly. This is one reason extreme habitats matter so much to the larger question of what dinosaurs were really like. Warm tropical settings can make almost any large reptile-like animal seem plausible. Polar settings are less forgiving. They force harder questions about metabolism, insulation, growth, and behaviour. Feathers become more meaningful in this context. If at least some dinosaurs carried insulating body coverings, especially smaller theropods or juvenile animals, those coverings were not just decorative curiosities. They may have been part of a real survival strategy in cooler or more seasonal environments. Long winter darkness also suggests sensory and behavioural adaptation. Animals living through months of dim light must either endure, relocate, or alter their way of life. Dinosaurs were not exempt from those practical realities. Polar environments are only one side of the story. Arid interiors mattered too. Many parts of the Mesozoic world, especially during the Triassic and in some later inland settings, were dry, strongly seasonal, and shaped by limited water availability. Dinosaurs living in these regions had to move across landscapes where food and water may have been patchy, where temperatures could shift significantly, and where open terrain offered different risks from wooded or wetter settings. Such habitats favour certain body plans and behaviours: efficient movement, flexible diet, access to broad feeding ranges, and perhaps seasonal travel all become more important when resources are unevenly distributed. A lush swamp creature this was not. Floodplains offered another demanding kind of world. They could be rich in food and water, but they were also unstable. Rivers change course, floods destroy nesting grounds, sediment buries landscapes, drought follows abundance. A dinosaur living on a floodplain inhabited a place of opportunity and disruption at once. Many famous formations, including the Morrison Formation and Hell Creek Formation, preserve animals from such settings. These environments supported rich communities, but they also required constant adjustment to changing channels, seasonal water, vegetation turnover, and occasional catastrophe. Abundance in nature is rarely offered without terms and conditions. Coastal settings introduced their own challenges. Dinosaurs living near shorelines or delta systems had to contend with shifting sediment, storms, brackish water zones, tidal influence and changing habitat boundaries. Some theropods, such as Spinosaurus, appear to have been especially associated with watery environments, showing that dinosaur life could extend well beyond the standard land-based clichés. Even without turning every unusual fossil into a sensational headline, it is clear that some species were adapted to habitats far more specialised than the generic prehistoric forests so often recycled in artwork. Research programs in polar paleontology, including Australian field teams working in Victoria and North American teams studying Alaskan formations, have been especially valuable in changing this picture. Their work, along with broader contributions from museums and universities, has shown that the dinosaur world included environmental variety on a scale that popular culture rarely reflects. That matters because harsh habitats strip away lazy assumptions. They show what dinosaur bodies could really cope with, and what they could cope with was a great deal. Dinosaurs were ecologically flexible, geographically widespread, and capable of living in conditions that range from warm floodplains to high-latitude seasonal darkness. They were not one-temperature animals for one-type landscapes. They were a broad lineage able to meet different environmental demands with different anatomical and behavioural solutions. That flexibility, though, should not make life sound easy. Harsh habitats remind us that dinosaurs were not simply impressive, they were vulnerable as well. They could endure difficult conditions, but they could also be injured, stressed, infected, and worn down by the realities of living in a dangerous world. Harsh environments were only part of the difficulty. Even in the richest habitats, dinosaur life was not a smooth procession of growth, feeding, and scenic survival. These animals were living bodies, and living bodies fail, break, heal badly, heal surprisingly well, become infected, wear down, and carry the marks of time. Dinosaurs were magnificent in many ways, certainly, but they were also vulnerable. That vulnerability is one of the clearest things the fossil record preserves, if it is read closely enough. A damaged bone, a swollen joint, a healed fracture, or a deformed limb can do something remarkable. It can take an animal that seems almost mythic in scale and return it to the ordinary biological fact of being mortal. The study of such problems is called paleopathology. It is the investigation of injury and disease in ancient organisms, using fossil evidence to identify trauma, infection, stress, degeneration, and developmental abnormality. In some ways, it is one of the most intimate branches of paleontology, because it deals not with species in the abstract, but with individuals who suffered particular physical consequences. A dinosaur with a healed rib fracture was not merely representing its lineage. It was an animal that had been hurt, survived, and kept moving long enough for the bone to repair. That changes the tone of the whole subject. It brings deep time uncomfortably and usefully close. Healed fractures are among the most direct signs of survival after injury. Broken bones have been identified in many dinosaur groups, sometimes showing clean healing and sometimes showing rougher, distorted repair. A fracture in a limb, rib, or tail vertebra tells at least two stories. First, the injury happened. Second, the animal lived beyond it. That second part matters. Survival after a serious injury implies either resilience, luck, support from body size or behaviour, or perhaps in some cases a social setting that did not immediately doom a weakened individual. It also reminds us that dinosaur lives were physically risky. Large bodies, uneven ground, combat with rivals, failed hunts, defensive blows, and predator attacks could all produce injury. Life in the Mesozoic was not padded for comfort. Infection is another recurring theme. Bite wounds could become infected. Broken bones could heal imperfectly. Tissue damage could spread into bone. In some fossils, abnormal growth and pitting suggest osteomyelitis, a bone infection that would have been painful and potentially debilitating. A predator surviving with an infected jaw or a herbivore living with damage to a limb was not simply carrying a dramatic fossil feature. It was carrying a biological burden. Some Tyrannosaurus specimens, for example, have shown signs of facial injuries and other pathologies that suggest repeated trauma over life. These may have resulted from prey struggles conflict with other tyrannosaurs, or some mixture of both. Whatever the exact cause, they show that living at the top of a food web did not exempt an animal from accumulating damage. Apex predators may have ruled locally, but they still had bodies, and bodies eventually send complaints. Arthritis and joint degeneration also appear in dinosaur fossils. This is especially meaningful in larger animals, where mass places long-term stress on joints, vertebrae, and supporting structures. A large sauropod or ceratopsian may have carried enormous loads over many years, and the wear of that life could leave traces. Degenerative joint disease, fused vertebrae, and abnormal bone growth around joints suggest that some dinosaurs lived with chronic pain or restricted movement. That does not mean every older dinosaur was hobbling sadly through the undergrowth like a pensioner muttering about weather and poor posture, but it does mean that aging in dinosaur bodies involved wear, strain, and mechanical decline, much as it does in large animals today. Developmental abnormalities add another layer. Some fossils show malformed bones, asymmetry, or other skeletal irregularities that may reflect problems during growth. These are particularly interesting because they reveal that dinosaur development could go wrong in ways familiar across vertebrate life. Not every skeleton was perfectly formed. Evolution produces populations, not flawless blueprints. Individuals vary, and some variation can be harmful. That truth applies just as much to dinosaurs as to any living bird, reptile, or mammal. Parasites are more difficult to identify directly, but evidence from related animals and occasional pathological traces suggests that dinosaurs too likely lived with them. Parasites are among the least glamorous but most universal facts of animal life. If an ecosystem has bodies, it usually also has organisms making a living from those bodies in less than welcome ways. Even without perfect fossil proof in every case, it would be deeply surprising if dinosaurs had somehow escaped this arrangement, while everything else around them had not. Nature is nothing if not consistent in its ability to make life complicated. Modern methods have made all of this far easier to study. Scanning technologies, including computed tomography, allow researchers to look inside fossil bone without destroying it. Microscopic analysis of thin sections can reveal internal structure, infection, remodeling, and healing patterns. Museum studies increasingly use imaging that resembles medical investigation in living animals, and that is not an exaggeration. Dinosaur science now draws at times on methods that feel almost clinical. A fossil can be assessed not just as a specimen of species identity, but as a patient history written in mineralized tissue. This does not make paleontologists ancient veterinarians, though one suspects some would enjoy the title. It does mean that the boundary between anatomy and lived experience has become much easier to cross. This matters because it strips away the mythic aura. The more dinosaur science improves, the less these animals resemble untouchable symbols of prehistory, and the more they resemble what they always were, organisms under pressure. They got hurt, they became ill, they developed abnormalities, they endured stress from climate, competition, hunger, and combat. Some recovered, some carried old injuries for years, some probably died because recovery failed. A healed bite mark is, in a way, one of the most moving kinds of fossil evidence, because it records not just violence, but persistence. Something terrible happened, and life continued anyway. It also helps explain why no single snapshot can define a dinosaur. The idealized adult body shown in illustrations or museum mounts is only one moment, usually reconstructed from the healthiest looking evidence available. The real animal may have limped, lost teeth, carried an infection, survived a failed encounter, or borne the long consequences of an injury sustained seasons earlier. The fossil record rarely gives complete biographies, but sometimes it gives fragments of hardship, and those fragments are enough to make the animals feel startlingly real. There is, however, one further way to make dinosaurs feel real, and it is perhaps the most surprising of all. Some clues to dinosaur biology are not buried in stone at all. They are still alive, moving through forests, coastlines, gardens, rooftops, and city streets, carrying forward one branch of the dinosaur story into the present day. The more carefully dinosaurs are studied, the harder it becomes to treat them as a wholly lost world. bones, eggs, feathers, growth patterns, brooding posture, and anatomy all point toward a conclusion that is no longer controversial in science, even if it still surprises people hearing it for the first time. Birds are living dinosaurs. That is not a poetic comparison, not a loose metaphor, and not a playful way of saying that sparrows are vaguely reptilian if stared at with enough determination. It is a phylogenetic conclusion, meaning it comes from evolutionary relationships. Birds are a surviving branch of theropod dinosaurs, and they carry that heritage in their skeletons, their lungs, their feathers, their reproduction, and their behaviour. This idea has a long history. In the 19th century, Thomas Henry Huxley argued for a close relationship between birds and certain dinosaurs, seeing anatomical similarities that were striking even with the limited fossil evidence available at the time. That proposal was bold, but for many years it remained incomplete and contested. Later, in the 20th century, John Ostrom's work on Deinonychus helped revive and strengthen the case. Deinonychus showed a body plan that looked startlingly bird-like in its underlying mechanics, with an active theropod skeleton, grasping forelimbs, a flexible neck, and features that fit far better with a dynamic evolutionary link than with the old vision of dinosaurs as evolutionary dead ends. Since then, modern phylogenetics combined with extraordinary fossil discoveries has made the relationship overwhelmingly clear. The evidence comes from many directions at once. Birds and non-avian theropod dinosaurs share wishbones, also called furculae, which help brace the shoulder region. They share hollow bones that reduce weight while maintaining strength. They share feathers, though those feathers vary in complexity and function across different lineages. They share similar brooding postures over nests, similar egg structures, and in many cases similar limb arrangements and skeletal details throughout the hip, wrist, shoulder, and skull. Even the lungs matter here. Birds possess a highly efficient respiratory system involving air sacs and one-way airflow, and growing evidence suggests that the roots of this system extend deep into theropod ancestry. In other words, some of the most distinctive things about birds are not recent inventions. They are inherited dinosaur features. This changes the emotional shape of the story quite a bit. Dinosaurs were not a failed experiment that vanished without remainder. One branch survived the end Cretaceous extinction and continued evolving into the birds that now occupy almost every continent and an astonishing range of habitats. Pigeons on railway platforms, crows on rooftops, chickens in farmyards, gulls over coastlines, and ostriches crossing dry ground are all part of the same deeper lineage. Some of them are graceful, some of them are clever, and some of them look like they are permanently one bad decision away from disaster. Evolution, as always, preserves both dignity and nonsense in generous proportion. Many supposedly strange dinosaur traits become much easier to understand when birds are taken seriously as living evidence. Feathers are no longer mysterious decorations from a lost era. Brooding behaviour is no longer surprising. Hollow bones, rapid growth, active metabolism, complex display, sound production, visual communication, and social behaviour all become part of a continuous biological pattern rather than isolated curiosities. Even the feet of a chicken, scaled and clawed, are enough to make the point if looked at honestly. The dinosaurian past is not hidden behind an impenetrable wall. In one sense, it is pecking at seed in the garden and yelling at other pigeons over a crust. This also resolves one of the largest misconceptions in the entire subject. When people say the dinosaurs went extinct, what they usually mean is that the non-avian dinosaurs disappeared at the end of the Cretaceous. That is true. Tyrannosaurus, Triceratops, Ankylosaurus, and all the other non-avian lineages did not survive, but Dinosauria as a whole did survive because birds are part of Dinosauria. The extinction was therefore both catastrophic and incomplete. It ended the giant terrestrial dominance of non-avian forms, but it did not erase the lineage itself. Seen in that light, dinosaurs become both more distant and more familiar. Their giant extinct branches belong to deep time, but their surviving avian branch remains woven through modern life. The dinosaur story did not end cleanly. It narrowed, transformed, and continued. That continuity may be the clearest final reminder that dinosaurs were never just monsters or icons. They were real evolutionary animals, and one part of their history is still alive all around us. And with that in view, all the scattered pieces begin to gather together into one answer. Dinosaurs were not simply what older imagination made of them. They were stranger, more varied, more biologically rich, and in one very important sense, they never completely left at all. So what were dinosaurs really like? They were not generic monsters, not a single type of giant reptile repeated across time, and not the slow, dim, tail-dragging creatures that older imagery made so familiar. They were varied, evolving animals with specific anatomies, different body coverings, different feeding strategies, different senses, and different ways of moving through the world. Some were feathered, some were armoured, some nested in colonies, some may have cared for their young, and many lived as part of crowded ecosystems shaped by climate, geography, competition, and change across immense stretches of time. Perhaps the most striking correction is not that dinosaurs were more terrifying than people once imagined, but that they were more biologically interesting. Their posture was more efficient, their growth was more dynamic, their behaviour was more complex, their world was far more diverse. They lived across floodplains, forests, coastlines, dry interiors, and even polar regions with long winter darkness. They were injured, they healed, they reproduced, they adapted, and one branch of them survived. Birds are not merely bird-like dinosaurs, they are dinosaurs. That may be the quietest and most beautiful part of the whole story. Science has not just recovered the outlines of these animals, but traces of their actual lives. Bones reveal growth and injury. Footprints preserve movement. Nests preserve care. Feathers preserve appearance. Fossils taken together do not simply show what shape dinosaurs had. They show that these were real organisms once living in a real world, and in the end that is the clearest answer of all. What dinosaurs were really like was richer, stranger, subtler, and more scientifically beautiful than the old myth of lumbering reptilian giants ever allowed.